Welcome to PixelTunes Radio,
a podcast where we have fun
talking about video games
and video game music.
I'm Mike.
And I'm Ed.
And this is episode 93, Norrin Radd.
Yes, we have a special guest with us today. It was a composer that neither one of us were really that familiar with. And then,
I knew of him.
Yeah, you found Retro City Rampage and you played Do or Die, which was the track that just let us in right now.
Yep.
And then we didn't play too much else from him, and then we had our fan favorites episode, I think the third one.
Yep.
And someone requested a song from Venture Kid. And we heard it, and both of us just looked at each other and were like, oh my god, this is amazing!
We both did guitar squeals with air guitars and orgasmed at the same time.
Yeah, and it's funny because, you know, I'm a huge fan of Tim Fallon, you're a huge fan of Iku Mizutani, and that song kind of met like somewhere in the middle between those two artists. So it was just really cool for both of us to really get into it. So I reached out to Norrin Radd, Matt Creamer himself, and he agreed to be on our show with us. So Matt, thank you so much for coming on the show with us and chatting a little bit about your music and sharing some of your favorite stuff.
Oh, my pleasure. I'm super happy to be here, guys. You have no idea how much I can nerd out about video game music. So like I'm really excited to just talk with like a couple of like seasoned veterans here. Like just hearing your guys' shows and seeing your guys' notes. Like you guys really know your stuff.
Awesome. Well, you were in the right place if you want to nerd out about music. That's for sure.
Insanely humble right now. So thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about you and how you got into video game music composition. Where did you come from? Did you have any professional music training, or was it something you just started as a hobby?
No, it was definitely a hobby for me. I did go to an art school when I was, from grade 3 to grade 10, actually, I went to an art school, and I went to public school after that, but I never took music, but, they do kind of, in an art school, they do kind of make you think about things a little differently, just by default, and I remember really liking video game music as a kid, so it was just something on the back burner for a really long time. And then it was Vert, actually, was the first guy that I ever heard. I always call him like the godfather of NES chiptunes.
Yes,
he was the first guy that I ever heard make his own NES chiptunes, and that was like in the early 2000s or maybe even the late 90s.
Right.
And that broke my brain. Like someone making their own Nintendo music was just such a really novel idea, and since I was, if you think about it, Nintendo hadn't been gone for that long at that point, and I thought I could do that too because he would upload his modules for ModPlug and stuff like
files,
that. Yeah. So I could open up those, and that was a really awesome way to learn how to make my own Nintendo music. So my first stuff, like, it was just fun. It was a hobby for me to, like, literally open up his files, delete everything he had, and then write my own music with his instruments. And I was doing that just as a hobby for a really long time. It's weird. I don't know how to explain why I would want to do that as a hobby. It's like, it was a free way to make music, like at that time, there was no recording gear for home studios yet. Like, this was the best way to make music, other than like open up a free copy of Cakewalk or something and draw in like general MIDI notes or something.
Family Tracker wasn't around back then, right?
Yeah, and if it was a really like makeshift version of it.
So it must have been quite a thrill then to have been like co-composer with Vert on Retro City Rampage then.
Yeah, you have no idea. There was a point in time where I got a hold of him on AIM, which like in Canada we don't even use AIM in Canada, so I had to like download AIM and use AIM because we used ICQ and MSN and then whatever it turned into after that. But AIM was nothing. No one here uses AIM. But I'm like, oh, he's on AIM, so I got AIM, and like I don't know how I got his contact, but like I had a conversation with him on AIM once, the first time I'd ever been able to actually talk with him, and he said stuff that broke my brain. Like, he actually made me a better NES composer just from me getting to talk to him. Like, before, it was all just a hobby, and I was like really amateur about Nintendo music, and I didn't know everything about Nintendo music, and at that time I was like, hey, if I want to add more channels to a Nintendo song, I should just add more channels. Like, I didn't understand exactly why the limitations were important, or like what made it good to want to follow the limitations. So after I had a conversation with Vert on AIM, I stopped using extra channels, and I started using the triangle wave as either on or off instead of having any volume fluctuation, because that's the way that Nintendo would do it. It's on or off notes. This mind-blowing conversation with Vert like changed the way I wrote music. Basically, from everything before Melodia was before Melodia di Infinita, the first chiptune album I put out. Everything before that was non-Vert influenced stuff, and then everything after that was Vert influenced, like from that conversation on AIM.
It's almost as if he like poured himself into your brain.
The essence of Kaufman.
Yeah.
Oh, the dude is
like
a legend.
A good fragrance.
Yes. No, yeah, he's definitely one of the, absolute most fantastic composers VGM has ever seen. We're both huge fans of him.
Yeah, we've talked to death about him.
Yeah, exactly.
To the point where we have lawsuits going. Like, he doesn't want us to. We have cease and desist orders.
Stop it! Just stop it right now.
Yeah.
Well, if I can add a little bit, this is something ridiculous. Something I've been thinking about. And sorry to like derail the podcast here, but in vert-related form, I feel like there's a couple of composers that came from the chiptune community, and maybe even the video game remix scene as well. There's a couple of composers I sort of came up with that I feel they're like modern day. I hate to say this too because it's so hyperbolic sounding, but I think it's true. They're like modern day Mozarts. Like, I feel like the way that they can express themselves through this particular limitation, or chiptunes in general, or just the way they, like, Vert writes music now for any medium, it's so technical and intricate, and I feel like no one gives these guys the credit. Like, another one is Shnabubula. These are amazing musicians that no one gives them the credit because they sound like, you know, the bleeps and the bloops, or they're coming from sort of this chiptune background or this retro background. But if you analyze the stuff, or if you know the limitations and you see what they did with them, there's like this extra layer to how impressive it is that they create the stuff they do. Mm-hmm. And you know, I'd love to create a list, like, or yeah, how about this? In like 200 years, I hope people still think about, like, they can consider these guys like the classics. You know, like, I feel like This is a modern classics that we're seeing and we're living, and it's hard to recognize it at the moment, but I really feel like these guys, I don't know, they're savants, I guess. Like, it's crazy.
Way ahead of their league.
Yeah, I think they'll get their recognition soon. You know, like Chibi Tech, Go 280, like all these pioneers in the chiptune scene. I actually do a chiptune podcast on the side called Impulse Project, and so we celebrate all of these composers. You know, we just do a whole show dedicated to them. So
that's great.
I love when, you know, chiptuners and VGM composers kind of intersect, because that's like both of my interests combined into one. So it's great to be able to like talk to you, who's come from the chiptune scene and also composes VGM. You know, so that gets my goat quite a bit. So, but why don't we jump into our first track?
Sure.
This is an NES track that Matt picked. We're gonna kind of go round robin a little bit. Matt's picked 6 tracks this episode, and Mike and I each picked 3 of his tracks that we'd like to share. So we're going to kind of go like Matt, then Mike, then Matt, then me, and kind of spread it all out over the show.
And Matt's picks are specifically tracks that have inspired him, that he's fans of, whereas our tracks are just tracks from Matt, specifically.
Exactly. So, starting off the show is Contra, the original Contra from the NES in 1988. This is Alien's Lair, composed by Hidenori Maezawa, Kiyohiro Sada, and Kazuki Muraoka. Let's hit it.
Alright, welcome back. That was Contra for the NES. The game came out in 1988. The track was Alien's Lair, and it was by Hidenori Maezawa, Kiyohiro Sada, and Kazuki Muraoka. So, Matt, why Contra? I assume based on all your NES work that I've heard that you're a big influenced fan from Contra, TMNT, pretty much anything that the Konami guys were putting out. So why specifically this track?
This track in particular, it kind of opens up a can of worms that we'll touch on throughout the show, I'm sure, because it's a common theme through all of my inspiration. But there's when you have to imagine the music you want to write through these limitations, the Nintendo limitations in this case, I always picture the composer sitting there and the producer would come in and be like, hey, we want this game to sound like, The Predator or something, the movie, and make it sound movie quality, like movie budget music, but through this tiny little chip. Like go ahead and do that for us if you could. And so I always picture the composer in this song. This is the last level in the game. You're getting to the aliens' lair. It's like a mix between Predator and Aliens, the movie. They're huge blockbuster movies at the time, and this is his attempt at writing an orchestral, hectic score. And when you break down orchestral music, a lot of times there's not a time signature that really is it's not 4/4. If you break down a lot of really hectic action sequences, they want to Mickey Mouse the music so it sort of matches what's on screen. So a lot of times the time signature is just whatever goes. And so it's kind of like an old Bugs Bunny movie at that point, or a Bugs Bunny show where every movement Bugs Bunny makes is kind of emphasized in the music. So that's what they call Mickey Mousing. But with this song, you notice the time signature is all over the place with this track. It's 5/4, it's 7/8, it's doing a bunch of stuff. Every section is a different time signature, and when I listen to it, and especially how hectic the notes are, you can very much tell that this is a last level. The final level in the game, and I just feel this was his attempt at writing an epic orchestral conclusion to an action movie in Nintendo chiptune format, and especially with Contra, which was 1988 or 87 in the Japanese release. They didn't really know how to make echo notes yet. This was a very fundamental kind of soundtrack. This is just as in the history of Nintendo music, they eventually started learning more and more techniques to make it sound a little better. So we were talking earlier before the show started about TMNT 3,
right?
That's where they knew all the techniques. They knew how to make echoes. They knew how to do little vibrato techniques, and Mega Man would do this too. Where they would actually have a sustained note, but after the note first plays for a second, they cut the audio for a split second, then bring the note back, and they'll have a bunch of staccato notes and so those little gaps in the audio, they actually create texture in the sound. So they learned a lot of stuff, is what I'm saying. By the 90s, but in 1988 with Contra, they hadn't really learned that stuff yet, so this is them figuring it out still. It's you can start comparing it to the trends at the time or things that they'd figured out at the time. So Nintendo is really great for that.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I have to take a breath. If you think about Zelda, for example, too, Zelda had no echoes. It was just the notes and maybe some vibrato.
Straight up.
That's incredible. Yeah, it's incredible that they could write these memorable melodies that had no texture. It was just the notes themselves. Then by the time Zelda 2 rolls around, every note has vibrato on. It's they just found the vibrato button on the NES. They're oh yeah, that's texture. Let's have texture all over the place. So Contra was an interesting demonstration of action music where they didn't have these techniques yet, but they were just learning it at this point. And there's a good interview with H. Maezawa, which his name is H. Maezawa in the credits, so I always call him H. Maezawa. There's an interview with him where he actually talks about that echo technique where you basically only have so many channels to work with when you're writing NES music. So to make it sound like there's reverb or echoes on your notes, instead of having two channels play the same riff, the first stage in the Batman NES game, that's a good example of where both square waves are playing the same riff, and the second one is just a little quieter and a little delayed, so it's a literal delay.
Right.
Yeah, I love that effect.
Yeah, it's a great effect, especially when you have a lead that is so good that both channels have to play it.
It's really funny that you mentioned Batman for the NES, because I was actually going to mention Naoki Kodaka. If you listen to some of his earlier work on the Famicom, for example, Wings of Medulla is a really good example of this. If you've ever heard that soundtrack, it's a very simplistic sounding soundtrack from him. And when you compare it with later stuff that he worked on, like Batman or Gremlins 2, or really like any of the stuff,
Super Spy Hunter,
Spy Hunter, like any of the stuff that he worked on later on, the sound specifically sounds completely different. I mean, Wings of Medulla sounds very flat sounding, and the composition is great, but it just feels very blank, very flat, very sterile. But then as these composers, learned more about the hardware, or even drivers, different drivers being introduced or whatnot, different techniques, you tend to notice a lot of changes with the music.
A lot of it is thinking outside the box too, because for the first first 2 or 3 years of the NES, you know, at least in North America's life, you had like, you know, your triangles, your bass, your square waves are your lead melodies, you know, your drums, if you had any at all, were on the noise channel.
Sure.
Nobody was thinking outside the box. Nobody's like, these could be different instruments. These could be configured differently. We could create new sounds with combinations of these channels. And so I think, you know, Contra exceeded very well just using those 5 channels, but just using those in the traditional sense. But then, like you said, Matt, as time went on, you know, with like Ninja Turtles and stuff, we start getting, like, we played Brooklyn Bridge is Falling Down, that really like bluesy guitar style NES track, which was using the triangle and the square kind of in tandem with each other to create this really kind of bluesy guitar sound. So those are the techniques that come later on that this game didn't really feature at all, and it wasn't even featured at all in this era.
Right.
In total.
Yeah.
That's why, the eras for NES is very, like, I always look to see where the year was, because, like, you can take Zelda and add more appreciation to it, because at that time, just the knowledge base for how to make the music, like, the composers were just, I always pictured just these, like, programmers that are, like, forced to do this impossible task, write this amazing music and make it memorable for all time, and have this, like, chip, this programming chip that, you know, if you think about what the Nintendo was, it was like a synthesizer that was just super cheap. Like, all you can do is a square wave and a triangle wave, and, you know, compared to the keyboards that these composers probably had access to at the time, it was probably super limited, and it was probably a very frustrating thing for them to have to work with these limitations and know that if I could just use my keyboard, it would sound so much better.
Yeah.
So they had to work within these limitations, and the stuff they came out with is like remarkable.
Absolutely.
This actually rolls right into a great question from one of our fans, Emily, who hosts the other VGM podcast, VGM Jukebox. She asked, why do composers limit themselves with these retro chips? Why do you limit yourself with retro chips nowadays instead of like going for, like, you know,
booming
30 square channels or something like that? You know, what's the thought process behind wanting to create authentic retro style music in the modern era?
Well, that's a great question. There's a lot of answers to. I think every chiptune artist would probably give you a different answer as well, which is kind of what makes chiptune interesting, because everyone kind of has their own reason for wanting to do it. For me personally, when I first started hearing Vert stuff, Vert was always kind of on the line. Like, he did a really cool Contra mod file that had, like, actual recorded guitar in it, and it was super, like, sample. It was still samples because it was a module, but, like, he used guitar in it with Nintendo sounds, and that was, like, you know, if you think about when he did that, like 2000 or something, that's really far forward thinking. And so I was always more interested in, like, the more intense Nintendo music. Like, if you think about the one we just played, the Contra track, like, that's a pretty intense Nintendo song compared to Mario or something. Like, it's clearly meant to be an intense song. And I've always been more fascinated by how intense the Nintendo music could sound. So when it comes to the limitations for me, one of the things I like is you can try and take these limitations that everyone has to work with. Like, here's another reason why Nintendo specifically gets a lot of tread. Every, like, legit Nintendo soundtrack was basically made on the same sounding patch, on the same sounding synth, like, if you want to picture it that way. So imagine if, like, in the 80s or nowadays, let's imagine nowadays everyone has one VST that they can use, and it has, like, 3 presets on it, the different square waves and stuff like that. And then you say, like, all right, now write different music than the guy next to you, see if you can do that. And so the Nintendo is, like, they all had the same building blocks, and if you think about how different every Nintendo track sounds, even throughout the years, and every composer kind of has their own little thumbprint of, like, this is what my version or my interpretation of these limitations sound like. So, you know, when it comes to the limitations, why I like to work with them is because it gets rid of the instrument itself having an effect on the notes. Like, it basically just becomes the thumbprint of, like, I always kind of say, like, what's your musical instinct? And that's, like, if a note is playing on a keyboard or you're hearing a note, what's the next note you want to hear? And so chiptune music for me is just that embodied. It's like you have the fundamental tone. We got rid of the instrument. Like, it's not a guitar, it's not a thing, it's just a tone, it's a note. What note do you want to hear next? And so I feel like that's why, you know, guys like Vert and Schnabubula that are, like, modern day Mozarts, I feel, in how they write, like, the note they want to hear next, I think is amazing. Like, I think they constantly do amazing things with what the next note is supposed to be. And so yeah, chiptune music for me, that's kind of why I like those limitations in particular. But there's other reasons to like those limitations too, aesthetic reasons and nostalgia and stuff like that. But that's the main one for me.
So yeah, and I totally agree with you. It's like kind of removing the audience judgment based on the medium that you're using and just focusing on what you're doing with that medium instead of the medium itself. So that's very cool. So you want to move into our next track?
Yes. So we're going to revisit what we came in with in the beginning of the podcast, Retro City Rampage. The track is Joyride, and again, it's by Norrin Radd, aka Matt Creamer.
Excellent.
Welcome back. We are here with Norrin Radd, aka Matt Creamer, and that was Retro City Rampage. The track was Joyride, and that was written by the man himself, Norrin Radd. I love this track, and I gotta say, longtime listeners of the podcast are gonna immediately know what I'm gonna jump to, and Ed's gonna tell you as well. Ed, what is it?
It's either galloping bass or harmonizing leads.
Yes, totally. And I love how. So here's my story. The very first experience that I think I had. I may have heard some of your work on possibly OCR Remix. It was before Retro City Rampage that I definitely heard your music. And it might have been OCR Remix. Did you ever put anything out on there?
Oh, this is embarrassing. Yeah, I have some songs on Overclock Remix.
You did? I could have sworn that you did. I may even have some like really, really old stuff. Because I've been listening to OCR Remix for years, like probably since like I think the very first track I ever heard was Protricity doing like the Mega Man X Spark Mandrill theme.
Oh, that's old as hell.
Super.
That's like an original OG member of the Overclock Remix.
oh, definitely. Oh, I was one of at least the first, I'd say 1,000. So I go way back in terms of remixes and all that type of stuff. But when I first started playing Retro City Rampage, I was following the game for a very long time. When it finally came out, I waited a little bit because they announced a Wii version, and I was like, I have the Wii, I gotta get it on the Wii, like, I gotta support it. And I think I reached out to the developer, I can't remember his name, Chris, I think?
Brian Provinciano.
Brian Provinciano, that's right. And I reached out to Brian, was like, hey, I really want to review this, I write for a website, retrocollect.com, can you send me a copy? He was like, yeah. So he sent me a copy. I knew I was going to love it. I reviewed it, loved the game. But I remember playing through the game, and whenever your track specifically, like, don't get me wrong, I love what was the other composer
Freaky
on there?
DNA.
Freaky DNA, yeah. That's right. I love all of their stuff, but specifically when your tracks, which are almost always full of, like, galloping bass, really awesome, like, shreddy guitar, and I would drive around in the car listening to that music, and when I knew I had to get out of the car and start the mission or like go do something or go to a spot where the music would stop, but I would just keep going in circles listening to the music.
It's the digital equivalent of waiting in your driveway when a song on the radio is awesome.
Yes, exactly. So I'm just like driving around listening to like Do or Die and Dance Off and all these types of tracks that were playing while you were in the car specifically. And Joyride just, it brings me back when I listen to it to those memories of me just driving in circles, hitting pedestrians, collecting coins, and just like waiting it out until I got sick enough of the loop to be like, all right, I guess I can go play the game now.
That's funny as hell. That's awesome.
Wow, that's crazy.
So, Matt, what was your influence or your direction in terms of creating a lot of the songs that you did make for Retro City Rampage?
Every song, like the way I write Nintendo music is, I usually start with like a little idea, such as galloping bass or something, and the song sort of forms around the idea. Because, like I said in the last segment, there's when you get rid of the instruments, like when you have a guitar in your hand, it's a little easier to write a galloping riff because you can visualize what the next note should sound like. You can really easily like, oh yeah, or even the type of guitar you're holding, you'd be like, yeah, I feel badass holding this thing. But yeah, with Nintendo music, you have to sort of decide ahead of time because there's none of that sort of, you're not holding a guitar in your hand. You got all these chip sounds, so you have to decide ahead of time. I want to try to do like a galloping riff here, and then from that it sort of spawns like, okay, what do the drums sound like during a galloping part, or like, you know, how would Iron Maiden do this? You know, you have to kind of always have this sort of protocol that you form. So every song kind of has a different protocol, and sometimes it's a time signature, sometimes it's I'll pick a scale or a mode. I'll be like, oh, I want to write in the Lydian mode. How about that? And so, you know, the songs sort of form around that. So that was definitely the theme for that one. I wanted to write it like a galloping sort of, not power metal, but like new wave of British heavy metal sort of track.
Sure.
Gotcha.
Yeah, definitely. So I gotta ask, since you did work with other composers with Freaky DNA and, of course, Vert, how does composing with other people who you may not be living or working within that same area work out for you? Like, for example, on Retro City Rampage, you were in different locations physically than the other composers. So how did that work? Were you like kind of bouncing back and forth with ideas? Or was it more like, oh, you take these tracks, I'll take these tracks? Like, how did that work?
Well, with Retro City Rampage, I was in the same city as Brian Provinciano and Freaky DNA, so if we ever really needed to meet up, we could do that. But yeah, Vert was, you know, I never actually met him during the course of that project. We never got to be at the same conventions at the same time. So yeah, I still have not met Vert, even though I have worked with him on a soundtrack. But there wasn't a lot of like cross-pollination between songs, even though we all worked with ModPlug for this, all three of us. That was actually why I got contacted to work on the project, because I was basically a Vert clone. Like, I made music the way he made music, and he made it on... he made it, and that's, by the way, like a super flattering thing, even to be a Vert clone. Like, I consider myself like second wave Vert. Like, he was first wave, and then like, okay, I'm second wave. Actually,
second gen 2.0. It's like Transformers when like Optimus Prime died, and they had like, you were like the
Rodimus Prime.
You were like Rodimus or like Hot Rod.
Yeah, Hot Rod. Yeah, that's kind of the thing. Is for my chiptunes, I was always trying to sound like Vert, but I have no idea how he did his sound. So the protocol is like, I want to sound like Vert, but if I don't actually know how to sound like Vert, then what you have is my interpretation of what Vert sounds like.
Right.
So that was, it's always kind of been my interpretation of what Vert sounds like. That's why I think I'm second gen, but like, in no way do I come close to the way Vert sounds. But that's kind of what gives my stuff its sound, because this is my interpretation, my genuine interpretation. I have no idea how he did the stuff he did.
So speaking of Vert and sound and like senses, we have a question from a listener, from Ben, also known as the Dyad, and he asks, which you may not be able to answer at this point, but maybe you can because you're a user of Essence of Vert. What does Vert smell like? What does Jake Kaufman smell like?
I can't. I wish I knew. I've never met him, but I know that I will meet him eventually, and he's due for one big bear hug. That's for sure.
Yes.
But you know, I picture him just like, I don't know. I picture him smelling like a rock concert, because I feel like he embodies, because he can play live as well. He can shred on the keys.
I've seen him live actually, and he's great. Yeah, he is really. I saw him at MagFest a while back.
Did you smell him from there?
I did not smell him, but if I were to put a smell to him, it would be like whatever disco smelled like in the 70s, mixed with the smell of Jewish prayer wine and apples and honey from Rosh Hashanah service.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Very
Mixed with a little bit
specific.
of Old Spice.
Yeah, the reason I say that is I've reached out to Jake Kaufman, and I've talked to him on specific. I can't remember what it was, but I think I left him a comment on his website.
He did a Jewish style remix of a Mega Man song or something on OC
He did,
Remix.
but he also did another song on his website that was named something Jewish. I can't remember. And I reached out to him somewhere, somehow, and I was like, this was amazing. By the way, are you Jewish? Or I'm assuming with the name like Kaufman, potentially you are, because my last name's Levy and I'm Jewish. So I asked him specifically, like, what experience do you have? And he was like, yeah, my father was a cantor in synagogue. So he obviously has that kind of background. So that's to me what he smells like is that and he throws a lot of that Jewish style music. A lot of those like influences do kind of rub off. Plus he has that just like awesome funk disco sound that he goes for with a lot of stuff like Mighty Switch Force and stuff like that.
Yeah, he's so good at combining them.
Yes.
So Matt, one other question I had for you, as far as Retro City Rampage goes, did you guys all share the same bank of NES sounds to make sure you guys all sounded cohesive within the soundtrack, or did you make your own NES sounds for your own tracks?
We really should have done that. That would have made a lot more sense, but we didn't. We all had our own stuff coming into it, and mine are a little too bass heavy, just based on the template that I was using. So Freaky DNA, he mastered it, and he did all the mixing. So mine sound a little like they needed the most touch up in post, sort of. So yeah, it would have helped. Like, just now that I make music for games on my own, I would never want there to be like multiple different templates for the Nintendo music. But I guess in the sense that they wanted to make it sound more like Grand Theft Auto, when you're listening to the radio, there's like wildly different, like it'd be like playing a game that has a Capcom style song, then a Konami style song, and
Good point.
So I guess it works out. We fluked out on that one, but you're right. I would have loved to have one unified sound bank.
Cool. So let's jump into our next track. What do you got for us?
Sure, this next pick is from Matt. It is Shadow of the Colossus. The track is called The Farthest Land. Came out on the PS2 in 2005, written by Ko Otani. And we're back. That was The Farthest Land from Ko Otani from the game Shadow of the Colossus, which came out in 2005 on the PS2. And Matt, I gotta say, I was not expecting a track like this from you, because a lot of your music is so energetic, but this is just, it's so beautiful, and I'm not as familiar with Shadow of the Colossus as everybody tells me I should be, so...
You really should be.
Yeah, where...
I'm not even, but you should be.
Where does this... where does this track play in the game? It feels like it's like something near like the end where things get really sad or something like that.
Oh, good question. This is actually this is maybe one of the hidden gems of the soundtrack, in that it doesn't play during the game. This plays during the attract mode.
Oh.
So it's kind of another story too. For this track, the reason why I picked it, one of the reasons why I picked this track is because if I were to pick the tracks that you guys would have probably expected me to pick, the whole thing would have been like bombastic, orchestral, crazy tracks. And I was like, I started doing that. I'm like, no, I got to diversify this list a bit, because I'm not just like I don't just like one type of music, even though I usually tend to write more bombastic music. Yeah, one of the reasons I picked this track is because the game itself, the story of the game, I feel like this song embodies everything about why this game is an amazing game. This is like a top 5 game all time for me, Shadow of the Colossus.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So, like, the story of the game, without spoiling anything, like, the very opening sequence is, you're on this horse, and there's a female on the horse that looks injured, like she's draped over the back of it, and you're sort of, like, trotting along towards, the farthest land, and you get to this, like, gateway, and you walk through this gateway, and you find yourself on this impossibly large bridge that goes all the way into the center of what is the sacred land. And the game map in this game is humongous. Like, think bigger than Grand Theft Auto. Like, it's a humongous map. And so this bridge takes you all the way to the center of the map, because in the game mythology, you're never supposed to step foot in the sacred land. And so that's why this bridge is here, that you can get to this shrine in the middle without having to step on the sacred land. So if you can imagine how big this bridge is. And so the whole story of the game is that, he's taking this injured female to this shrine for whatever reason. And as the game unfolds, you find out that, like, there's some pretty dramatic reasons why he would choose to, like, violate the sacred land and do all the things he's doing. So when you think about the game, it's not about toppling these colossi and being this ultimate hero. It's like a really somber reason why the character would be doing all the stuff in the game. And I feel like this song, if you get me in the right mood, I can definitely crack out a couple tears to this song just based on the game alone. So yeah, it's a special track for sure.
Yeah, I definitely love, like, the string instruments, and then those kind of, like, almost pan flutes, or like almost penny whistles that come in towards the end. They're just beautiful.
This sounds like if an Italian person took Italian instruments, went to New Zealand, and wrote a song.
Yeah,
okay.
I could get that.
Right?
I can get that, for sure.
Yeah. That's what I got, a very Italian vibe. There's a lot of like
Ennio Morricone scores Lord of the Rings or something.
Right. Yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Yep.
It's got a lot of like flourishes that kind of go through, a lot of like string harmonies and everything. It's very, very interesting and very unique. And I felt like the game was very empty.
Yes.
Like all you pretty much have is the bosses, and that's it. So it's almost, to me, it's like if Zelda 2 was more modern and completely devoid of enemies.
Yeah.
And just had bosses.
I think that's why, a lot of people really love this soundtrack, and I think that's one of the reasons why, because the game is so empty, the music kind of has to speak for the game. Right. And I feel like, especially with this track, if it were just a guy carrying a woman over a bridge, you wouldn't exactly know what to feel in that kind of an instance, but the song really tells you this is not a good situation. This is a guy who's doing this because there's some sort of sacrifice that's involved or something like that. So, is that the same kind of feeling that you got from this track, Matt?
Yeah, like you said, the game doesn't have any enemies in it, and it doesn't have any music until you actually reach one of the bosses. So there's no enemies in the game, there's no music in the game until you get to the bosses, and that's what makes this game so special, because why then would this guy violate the sacred land? What is his purpose in there? Like, it like amplifies and it resonates. Like, why is he here doing all these things? And you get this sort of sense that, like, nothing is on the sacred lands. Like, you're not supposed to be there. There's no creatures, there's no houses, and for some reason he's there, and he's, like, laying waste to these, essentially, like, these guardians that sort of protect the sacred land, and it just makes me want to know more and more. You get out of it what you put into it, sort of, and so when I played this game the first time, I had headphones on, and I was, like, playing the game with like just listening to the ambience. Like when you go through the hilly valleys, like you hear wind going past you and stuff. It's like amazing sounding, super. It just puts you there, like sort of
very atmospheric.
Yeah, for sure.
It's yeah, that's funny. So it's like basically the people online you were saying were essentially searching for the Shen Long of Shadow of the Colossus.
Yeah.
Very cool.
All right.
So I guess we'll jump into our next track.
Yeah, moving from a game that has almost no characters to a game that has a ton of characters.
Yes.
This next track is from the game Swap Heroes, and this is Stage 4, Lost Sands by Matt Creamer. And we're back. That was Stage 4, Lost Sands from the game Swap Heroes. It's a mobile-only game. And so this is a song that you composed in the style of SNES, correct? So not many chiptuners kind of go for that. So what made you choose that particular sound for this soundtrack?
That was the developer. They wanted some SNES stuff, and I was very happy to oblige.
I was going to ask, why do you think that there's a lack of Super NES style VGM these days? I mean, in most cases, it's all like NES inspired, Genesis inspired, but you don't generally hear a lot of Super NES stuff. Do you know why that is?
I maybe have some theories. You know, the Super Nintendo used samples, so it was a sample-based system. I feel like there's two things here. One, I think people have trouble finding the samples. Like, there's decent sort of fan-made archives for samples out there, but they're not very robust. Like, if you're lucky, you can find like a Chrono Trigger kind of sample bank, and so you can kind of use similar samples from Chrono Trigger, but not a lot of deep samples there, because in order to get the samples, you kind of have to know how to, you know, dabble in some of the grayer areas of like ROM hacking stuff. And so with Super Nintendo stuff, to make it sound authentic, it's weird, because built into the sound chip was this echo effect that they could use. It's this very iconic sound that the Super Nintendo had, and I feel like people would probably just want to use normal samples instead of Super Nintendo samples, like orchestral sounds, because at this point you're kind of writing an orchestral song or something that isn't good sounding. Like, it's kind of this weird way, like we were talking about with the Nintendo limitations, everyone had the same level playing field. It's like, use this triangle wave, use this square wave. But with the Super Nintendo, you're like, you can use a slap bass sound now if you want, and you could use a guitar sound if you want. They're just kind of really bad sounding on their own, you know? Like, they're like, one of the things, Street Fighter 2, for example, I don't think has good instruments. I think it has really bad instruments, like from a quality standpoint, but they did amazing composition. So it almost makes it more difficult and more frustrating. Like, some of these sounds are not what I want to hear. Yeah. So, you know, with this song in particular, I really had to hand select the best of the best. Like, here's what I find is the best sounding SNES string, like ensemble sound. Here's what I find is the best sounding trumpet sound. best sounding like sort of guitar strum sounds, and I put all the best sounds together. So I just think Super Nintendo's maybe a harder thing for people to wrap their head around, because with FamiTracker and stuff, like, you can use this already built-in thing to make Nintendo music, and with Super Nintendo stuff you have to sort of adhere to your own limitations, which is something I'm already very good at because I did a lot of mod plug stuff. So yeah, it's a hard one. I don't know. I wish more people would.
Yeah. I think it's because the SNES doesn't really have like that, like quote unquote that sound, you know, capital T, capital S, because you're using samples, so it can sound like almost anything. You know, you compare something Tim Follin did to something Koji Kondo did, and it's like you would never know they were on the same system. So I think when composers want to do something like that, they say, okay, well, I can go Super Nintendo limitations, but the average listener isn't going to say, oh, hey, this must be Super Nintendo, when they'll definitely recognize NES or definitely recognize, you know, FM, Genesis stuff. So
right.
I think it's a matter of that kind of recognition, too. But that being said, I did recognize, at least to me, it sounded like there was a lot of, like, stuff from, like, Secret of Mana, a lot of that, like, Squaresoft style instruments in here.
Should have went for those terribly but awesome, obnoxious trumpet sounds from Final Fight.
Yeah. the muted French horn.
Yeah.
Or the slap bass from...
next time, for sure.
Next time, yeah.
Or the slap bass from Paperboy 2.
Yes, oh god, the Seinfeld bass. So this actually leads into a question that we got from one of our fans, listeners, Cam Childs, and he asks, is there a certain mindset or set of guidelines you follow when trying to achieve 8 or 16-bit sound?
For me, I can't speak for other composers, but for me, it's always about, like, so if I'm doing Super Nintendo, I'm gonna open up the best Super Nintendo tracks, like my favorite tracks, and try and see exactly how they made them sound the way that they did. So what I did for Swap Heroes and what I did for Treasure Buster and what I did for actually the 8-bit stuff as well is I'll load up the tracks themselves in Winamp. I'm still using Winamp. Classic skin for life.
Yes.
You guys know.
Yes.
So I'll load up a track and I'll actually rip it. So, you know, are you guys familiar with NSF files and VGZ files and
of course, yeah,
SPC files? Okay.
I bathe in them.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm just making sure, because sometimes they don't, and I have to enlighten people, oh my god, I'm about to explode your world. So I'll open those up in Winamp, and I'll actually open it up 8 times. Like for the Super Nintendo, I'll open up 8 versions of it, and then I'll record them all. It's just the way I try and do it quicker, but I'll rip each channel to its own WAV file, and then I'll open that up in Cubase, and then I'll actually see where they're combining instruments and how they utilize their instruments and what they were doing in order to achieve the exact sound that they were. And I also open up I've been using this program called, let me just open it now, SPC Tool, which is a gray area ROM hacking tool, but it lets you open up the music from SPC files, and you can actually see the exact specifications for what they did for the instruments, like how much echo was on it and things like that. So the same thing with Genesis as well. That's basically my process. So it gets a little harder when I'm doing PlayStation stuff. PlayStation was sample based as well, unless it was CD based, which some games had as well. You can't really break those down as well because there's not as good ROM hacking tools, so it's harder to break down exactly how a sound sounds or why it sounds a certain way, and that gets really difficult. But with these old consoles, it's perfect because you can break it down and see exactly what their thought process was.
That's awesome. And that's, that seems to be a little more involved than, because with FamiTracker, it's you don't really have to worry so much about that because those limitations are already kind of there for you. Unless you want to emulate a specific sound from a specific game, you're always within the confines of what, an NES can do. So I think maybe a lot of composers that, maybe might want to stay away from the Super Nintendo just because there is so much education going on, and the guys that just kind of want to just get right down and get into writing the music maybe might shy away from that a little bit. So it's great that you put that work and that effort into doing it, because the results were amazing. I feel like you could import this song into a Super Nintendo ROM and be able to be played very easily without being able to be edited or anything like that. That's very cool. So a little bit about this game, Swap Heroes. It's kind of just like an infinite RPG battle. Is that how it goes? Have you played this game much, Matt?
I played it in the development while I played it to see how the music should work with it, so I've never gotten really far. And actually, any of the games I work on, I just don't have the time to keep, I'm always writing more music.
Right.
So I've only played it sort of in a test phase or sort of the debug mode.
Okay.
Yeah, this game is actually kind of fun. It's like, so if you imagine, like, you got 4 people in your party, I think it goes up to 6 people in your party, and enemies just keep coming at you. You have to basically figure out how to defeat these enemies. It's turn-based, so it's kind of like Final Fantasy style.
Protect Me Knight, but turn-based?
Not really, because you never actually move. It's always just a static screen.
Oh, okay.
You beat a series of enemies or more enemies. Like, think of like a survival mode in Final Fantasy, something like that.
Okay.
And in between every battle, you are able to use the experience you gain to level your characters up and stuff. So if you really like RPG battles, but don't really like walking around the map and encountering random enemies or reading stories, like this is a good game to play.
Okay.
But it fits. I mean, this music definitely fits that kind of like RPG battle, but not to the point where it's like constantly like go, gotta beat these enemies. Right. It's got kind of an RPG story feel mixed with kind of a battle feel, so it gives you a very, very cool kind of combination between the two. It's something you can listen to on repeat almost ad infinitum without getting tired of it.
That's perfect. Mission accomplished.
Cool. All right, let's move into our next track. Speaking of Super Nintendo, this is Contra 3. It came out in 1992 for the Super NES. The track is Streets of Neo City, and it's by Miki Higashino, Masanori Adachi, and Tapi Iwase.
All right.
Welcome back. That was Contra 3, the 1992 Super NES masterpiece. The track was The Streets of Neo City, and it was by Miki Higashino, Masanori Adachi, and Tapi Iwase. Now, we're not going to talk too much about the composers, in all honesty, just because we've talked to death about them before. If you want a better understanding of their previous work, check out episode 14 of PixelTunes Radio, which was the best of Contra.
God, that was episode 14?
14.
Jeez.
I know.
Feels like yesterday.
I know. We're grandpas of VGM.
So I consider this one of like the most iconic SNES soundtracks and one of the most iconic SNES songs. I mean, I think everybody and their mom owned Contra 3 growing up. So, this is one of the first tracks you hear play in the game. The city's on fire, it's burning. You've got these like huge like violent dun 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 dun, like cellos going in the background. And
I never noticed
fantastic.
The drums until I listened to it through headphones just now.
Yeah.
Those drums are just so booming, just boom, 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 boom. It's really like just full sounding.
Yeah. So Matt, I mean, we just talked about Super Nintendo music and your emulation of Super Nintendo music. Oh, by the way, which software did you use to compose in the Super Nintendo style? I don't think we asked you that last break.
I used Cubase, so just used Contact, which is a sampler, and loaded up my own Super Nintendo style sounds.
So you can definitely tell, like, a lot of that echo and a lot of those kind of techniques that you were talking about can definitely be applied to this particular song. Why did you choose this particular song to share with us today?
A couple reasons. One that we haven't touched on yet is I feel like this song is the evolution of the Contra Aliens Lair. Like, I feel like that was what, if you wanted to write, like, the producer would come into the composer's studio and be, like, saying, I need you to write an epic action orchestral track, and here's the limitations that we have with our soundware. Go ahead and like have at it. So the Aliens Lair was what the NES composer would sort of come up with, and this is what the Super Nintendo composer would come up with. And they had the ability now to use samples, so they could have like timpani hits, bum 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 bum. They could hit the sounds they wanted, but it was just sort of lo-fi sounding. Yeah, that's one thing I really like about the song, is you can put those two tracks together that we've done in this episode and hear the evolution of why Super Nintendo was now you're playing with more power, like this was the example. Like when we're kids and we're playing this, that sounded like an action soundtrack to us. It went from sounding like bleeps and bloops to now I hear timpani hits and string sounds. This feels mature or something like that. This feels like the next level.
Yeah.
And so that's one reason why I picked it. And the time signatures too in this song are bananas. Like it's very much like the Predator had, an action soundtrack with crazy time signatures and stuff, because that's the way action soundtracks usually are. And this track is just buck wild. I love this track.
It's weird when it comes to Super Nintendo music, because I generally, when I first started playing Super Nintendo, most of the music all sounded very similar to me. I'd say that there's two examples that really stood out to me in the beginning of the Super Nintendo's library that made me kind of light up and go, oh man, like this is just a game changer for video game music. Even back then when I was a little kid, probably about 10 or 11, and one would be the final fight, which we talked about just before, the French horn, the trumpets, those
instruments that sounded like real instruments.
Definitely. Yeah. And then the strings in Super Castlevania 4. Yeah, when especially that boss battle, when you'd hear the strings kind of like quiet down and then rise back up like
still that remains one of the best instrument sets of any Super Nintendo game, and it's such an early game too. And it's like nobody's come close to sounds that sound that like rich.
Real.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, one of my favorite soundtracks of all time.
Definitely.
Well, in my process of studying the Super Nintendo music for Swap Heroes, I kind of had like this attitude going into Super Nintendo composition. Like from a thematic standpoint, I thought that it was too easy. They gave you the gave you the samples now. You like the struggle is over. With NES, if I want to do a power chord, I have to come up with this sort of way to make it happen, where I'm using multiple channels, and I found out that like inverting the power chord is where it sounds the best. But yeah, that's a story for another time. So with the Super Nintendo, I just found that like it was a little too easy. Like now I can just use a power chord sample. Like what's the big deal? So when I actually started investigating how Super Nintendo music was made for Swap Heroes, that's when I started to learn that especially these early games like Contra 3, they were using the same exact mentality that they were for the NES. They were just doing it on sort of like the next, what's the word here? It was like the next level, basically. So they only had so many instruments for this soundtrack, but you get the impression that there's tons and tons of instruments, but they actually only have about 10 samples for this soundtrack, and everything was made with those 10 samples. So it was just like the Nintendo, where like, well, we only have a couple of square wave duty cycles we can use and a triangle wave, and then maybe some drum sounds that we can do really lo-fi stuff with. So what they did, like when you open up Contra 3 in a program like SPC Tool, which is like a ROM hacking thing, where you can actually see how they're using the 8 channels and what instrument is loaded up at all times, they're actually shuffling through all 8 channels with all different instruments so that they can make it sound like there's more. So if channel 1 has like sort of the lead in it, I swear that the programmer must have just have written a priority sequence or something. So, okay, this note when it first hits gets priority, so make sure it's on a channel and make sure it gets heard. But then, like, lower priority things can have echoes later on, and so they would just find, like, a channel that had a less priority, or one that would have more priority would just take over. So when you look at it, like, all 8 channels are all over the place. So when I were to rip these channels, like I said last time, rip all 8 channels and open them up in Cubase, you see that each channel is just swapping all the time. Like, it's not like bass is channel 1, guitars are channel 2. It's like everything is everywhere. And the reason they do that is because they want it to sound bigger so that they can have this priority. So they actually simulate having more than these 8 channels by sort of doing what the Nintendo would do with their echo notes, where you only had 2 channels and you want to make an echo. You don't want to have both channels playing the same thing, so you have to take your one channel and hand write the echo somewhere in that channel.
Yeah,
so they're actually
that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, they're doing it times 8, and so I gained tons of respect for Super Nintendo composers, especially in the early games, like Castlevania 3 as well, and Metroid. Oh my gosh, Super Metroid. You know, most of the music in Super Metroid sounds all ambient because they just took like their brass sample, which would just be like, if you just play it without a loop, it would sound like this, meh, and that's the instrument. And what they'll do is they'll loop it, but they'll play it like 4 octaves too low, so it's just like this droning ambient sound. And they repurposed all of their sounds so that they could make this soundtrack. So they were doing innovative things, even though you think like, oh, it must just be a sample for a low drone. It's like, no, this is the sample for the brass that they repurposed to sound low. And so you get the sense of these composers just toiling away, like, how are we supposed to make this amazing sounding music when we only have meh as our sound? Like, come on.
Just a bunch of sheep bang at each other.
Yeah.
But just going back to that theory you had as far as priorities with the Super Nintendo goes, I totally agree, and I think that has a lot of validity, because when we did some back and forth via email with Iku Mizutani, did a lot of Super Nintendo and Nintendo composition, and he said when he was managing sound for other composers, he would have to determine which tracks got priority when sound effects came in.
Wow.
So I'm kind of combining these two theories together and being like, well, maybe there is a priority script set up for the Super Nintendo so that, when Bill Reiser shoots his gun and there's an explosion, what's the least important instrument that we can take out to substitute in that sound effect and still make the song sound, big without the whole lead instrument dropping off. So it kind of makes sense that these effects might kind of change channels based on what they want to substitute in or out when sound effects need to take the place of them. So that's really cool.
Yeah, and I mean, even on the Super NES, like the emulators, when you boot up like SNES, you could turn the channels on and off, which we've talked about before on the show. What's interesting, which we've never really talked about, is depending on which game you play, the channels change all the time. So if you're turning off one channel in one game, like Mega Man X, for example, you'll turn on or off a channel for like Super Castlevania 4 or something of the sort for a totally different game, and you'll be turning off something, instead of you turning off drums, you're turning off like
it's not assigned like MIDI. Like channel 10 isn't always percussion, that kind of stuff.
Could be turning off a lead line or
sometimes you might turn off a lead line, or you'll solo out that one channel and you get the lead line, but then the lead line will stop and then some hi-hats will come in and it'll change its instrumentation within the same channel. So SNES is a very complicated beast, much more complicated than, I guess, as your point before, much more complicated than most people might actually think. There's a lot of prioritizing and just tomfoolery going on behind the scenes when you're listening to a cool track.
Definite tomfoolery.
Tomfoolery all around.
They fool around so much. So one thing I want to just mention before we go off Super Nintendo stuff is while I was using this SPC tool to sort of investigate sounds, I did do sound effects for a certain game after Swap Heroes that still hasn't come out yet, but in investigating the sound effects for the Super Nintendo, I also thought that the sound effects were just samples, like, oh, we recorded a sword slash or something, and there's the sample for that. But it turns out the Super Nintendo uses instruments like tones and stuff to generate their own sound effects, much like the Nintendo would have had to do. And that blew my mind, because sound effects were not samples. They were created with instruments, and a lot of times, like, they'll repurpose Zelda 3, for example, when you open up a treasure chest, just the snare drum sound effect played twice, so at different
that's
cool.
Different I didn't even think about that.
So one thing, it's just an anecdote that I would love to share with your listeners is Lavos, the Lavos sound in Chrono Trigger. So when you meet Lavos and he just makes that guttural sound.
Yeah.
There's another technique the Super Nintendo could do called pitch mod, and it's basically like FM modulation but without a sine wave. So it just sounds like noise, weird garbled noise. And so what they did was they took the choir sample from the game and they used pitch mod on it, and it turns it into that garbled like
that's cool.
Like, think about, like, the composer is in his studio toiling away, we need to make this sound, and he uses the choir sample to do it. That's so perfect, because Lavos, I don't remember the storyline, but I think he was like an evolution or some sort of something, I can't remember, but to use a human voice and run it through pitch mod is exactly, like, you can start to pick apart what they were thinking when they were doing this stuff, and that's just, it makes me smile so much.
It's awesome. Really funny that you bring that up, because we were actually on our Facebook group. We have a very active Facebook group, and I posted asking everybody in the group, like, what are sound effects that you still remember from any video game that, like, are burnt into your memory. And the one that I presented was the Lavos growl or guttural thing that you were talking about. So that's just, like, blowing my mind, because that literally terrified me as a teenager playing that game. So now that I know that it's just a chorus sound with a pitch modulation, I'm just kind of like, I don't know, it takes a little bit of the mystery out of it.
You ruined him.
You ruined Lavos for me. How dare you? We invite you on the show, and you ruined Lavos for us. I can't. I just can't even with you, Mr. Norrin Radd.
We'll have to. I think by the time you finish the next track, you'll have forgiven Matt.
Oh, absolutely.
Because what's coming up next?
Our next track is Venture Kid on the iOS. This is level 4 Volcano. So excited to play this track. Let's go into it.
All right.
Welcome back. I hope you brought a change of underwear. That was Venture Kid on the iOS. That was level 4 Volcano. Oh, so good.
Yeah.
I gotta say, so listening to the whole soundtrack is just phenomenal from start to finish, but this track in particular really grabbed me because it made me interpret the song in my own, voice, if you will, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, I'm listening to this track, and I keep in mind I still haven't played the game. I really just I'm like a hardcore console and handheld only kind of guy. I'm not a big fan of Steam or any of that type of stuff. Just not my bag. And I'm also not a big mobile gamer. But I really want this game to come out on Steam or something. Just anything that's not mobile so I could actually play it. So I don't know the visual context of what's going on in the game, but I'm listening to this track, and when that lead harmony kind of rolls in, and I'm like, okay, this is good. This is really groovy. I'm feeling this. It's like a rock groove, rock dance funk. It's got so many different elements that are going on through it. Then, you've got that kind of groovy bass that's also in the background. But then you throw in that octave change with the additional harmony that kind of pairs up with that. And then it goes off on a tangent on its own. And then you just have 2 layers of lead harmonies going all over the place. And so after maybe about 15 loops of that, just me rocking out to that in my car, I'll start singing when the melody comes in. So you've got the da na 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 da na da da, and then when it goes into that da na 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 na, it's all over the place. So what I do when I'm driving and listening to the song is I'll throw in a 3rd layer, and I'll just riff on that on my own and just start vocalizing and just going absolutely balls to the wall, into this, just grooving out.
People are looking in the rearview mirrors thinking this poor kid's having a seizure, you know.
Yeah, like, I could totally picture just, like, people pulling up next to me at a stoplight, and they're just looking over at me, and they're like, what's wrong with this kid? Like, God. So, yeah, I don't know what it is about this particular song, but I just feel like you could stack infinite layers of the same thing on top of it, where it just goes with that da-na-na-na-da-na-da, and then as soon as it splits, and you've still got that main, you know, and it's like up and down like that, you could stack just infinite layers on that part right there, and it would just be like a wall of noise, but somehow I would just absolutely love it.
You would just grow wings.
I would grow wings and fly off. I would turn into an 8-bit track. Just, that's what would happen to me.
8-bit track incarnate.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So I gotta know, like, what is that, like, something that you were trying to kind of get people into doing, like, kind of vocalizing their own harmonies with this, or did you have? Are you like looking at me like, what a freak?
Wow, no, even just you picking this track in particular, this was actually what I found was like one of my least favorite tracks on this soundtrack. And when I listen to my music after, there's like it degrades, like the effect of how much I enjoy it degrades over time. And this was like one of the earliest ones where I'm like, yep, I'll skip that track. Yeah, but the thing is, just the way you explained it now, like, I remember when I was making this track, and the case that I've kind of been typecast, where I make these games that have a forest level, a desert level, an ice level, like I just always have to do this. But a volcano was one that, like, I don't even know what a volcano should sound like. I have no reference for that. So with this song, I kind of just wrote something. I didn't write with a theme in mind, so it probably just spilled out kind of how I would naturally want to write a song, which I've learned to curb my natural melody writing instinct, just because I get so many rejected tracks when I go off course. Like, I need the developers to tell me exactly what they want so that I can get it right. So yeah, this track must have, I don't know what happened with this track, but I didn't have anything in mind with it. I just wanted to write a lead. So that intro part is the build up, and it might build up too long in my opinion, which is maybe why I don't like it. For a 40-second track, it's funny that I'm like, it builds up for too long. Right. It just sort of busts into that solo, and so the track is basically just the first part and then the solo, and that's the whole loop.
Right.
So I think I just wanted a solo, and I don't know, I didn't even think about it. This is I'm gonna have to ponder this.
You mentioned a volcano. It's a perfect analogy for that, because you know, when a volcano explodes, the lava's going everywhere. It's going in different places, different locations. It's going down the mountain, and it's kind of spreading out. And that's kind of what I feel this track is doing. Is it's like spreading out and moving with
just spurting its musical lava everywhere.
Yes, spurting that hot, warm stuff.
Yep, keep going.
Everywhere. Yeah.
Well, you gave me a new appreciation for this track, actually. This is I'm gonna have to think back on this big time.
Interesting. So this actually leads us right into a great question from one of our fans, Chris Murray. He asks, as far as Adventure Kid soundtrack goes, which track for this game is your favorite, and how long did it take you to write the whole soundtrack?
This soundtrack, I think, took me like 3 months or so to write. I wasn't doing music as my full-time gig at that point, so it was more of a part-time thing for me, so I wasn't like toiling away for 3 months straight. But Nintendo music is definitely harder to make than, like, someone could come up to me and want a AAA orchestral score. It would take me no time at all to write that. Whereas Nintendo music takes like exponentially more time, because every time you write a note that has an echo somewhere else in that channel, anytime you change that note, then you also have to change the echo. So there's like multiple more levels of difficulty, not to mention you can't use effects. You can't use reverb or delay or chorus. Like, you have to, if you want chorus, you have to take 2 notes and detune them slightly. So yeah, this was a very long soundtrack to make, because coming off of Slayin', they wanted Nintendo music, and at this point, actually, damn you, Vert. Here's what happened during Retro City Rampage. I got to actually see some of his mod files for his FX3 album that he came out with, and
I love that album.
Yeah, it's crazy, and that he was still using ModPlug for that, and that's where I realized some techniques that, like, I was doing really sloppy work when it came to Anomaly. What I did for my sample for almost all of Anomaly was I opened up an NSF file, and I think it was just Cosmic Wars was the game I opened up. It's just a Konami game. opened up one of their songs and tried to find the longest sustaining note I could, and then just chopped it out and made a sample of that. Because I'm like, I don't know how to get it to sound as warm as the Nintendo sounds, because if you just use a raw square wave, it sounds a little tinny and it's harsh on the ears. So I opened up that, made my own sample, and almost all of the power chords you hear in Anomaly are written with one sample, and it came from like an actual NSF. So when I opened up Vert's file, he had a ton of instruments he'd made, like multiple octaves, and he'd organized it all really well, and that's when I realized I've been like doing myself a disservice by using one sample, whereas I could write multiple samples per octave and it would sound warmer and warmer and warmer. And the way I could do that is open up FamiTracker and write and like just make a song that is an octave of each note, so I could have a long sustaining octave, or every note could be recorded basically to its own sample. So I made my own sample library from FamiTracker so that I could open it up in ModPlug and write my own music that way. And it's the most ridiculous way to go around working in FamiTracker, but I just didn't like using FamiTracker, so I had to do this. So working on Slayin', I did a bit of that, and then when it came to Venture Kid, I knew more, and I made a huge sample library for Venture Kid that I could try and simulate Capcom sounds a little better and things like that. So yeah, making it took a very long time, from writing it and like constructing it as well.
Cool. Well, I did notice, like we were talking about before we even started recording, but I did notice a lot of samples that did sound very similar to like the Ninja Turtles 3 soundtrack. So did you actually take the NSF from that soundtrack and rip samples from that game, or did you create those by hand?
What I did was I opened up NSF files in like a hacked version of FamiTracker called NSF Import, and it lets you open up NSF files in FamiTracker. It's mind-boggling. So you can actually see how all the NES music was made. So if you're like, that's a great effect, I want to sound like that, you see exactly how they did. And that's why I knew that Capcom and Mega Man, to get some of the texture that they wanted, they would have the note hit and then cut the note immediately and then have it come back. So I would use that technique a lot in this game. And so I'm using basically the core sample library for the NES. So each duty cycle for the square waves. Turtles 3, they did that a lot. Like almost every note has a different duty cycle at the start and then a different duty cycle to sustain. And so I would make samples for that as well. So the 12% duty cycle going to the 25% duty cycle and on and on. So I made the sample libraries for each different sort of multi-duty cycle samples you could get, and then looked at how they made the sounds using NSF Import. And then so I would use their sounds with their techniques.
So you're practically almost making like an NES sound emulator within OpenMPT, like just really kind of taking all of those function calls and like importing them almost into that's really into like a tracker format. That's really cool. That's really in depth.
Yeah, and the thing is, the reason why I didn't like using FamiTracker for the longest time is because it had this default thing where if you double click anywhere on it, it selects the whole column, or it selects the whole bit that you're editing on. And with ModPlug, the way that I edit, I use mouse in one hand, keyboard in the left hand, and so if I want to go down a couple columns, I'll just lower my mouse down a couple columns, click once, and then the whole thing shifts down. So if I click again, it'll shift me down again by that amount. So I'll go click, 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 click to go all the way down. And so when I'm writing a FamiTracker, I'm like click, click, and then everything would get highlighted, and I'd be like, I don't know what's happening. And it took me a long time to realize, like, oh, it's just double click that's happening. And so I'd actually sent the developer of FamiTracker like a feature request, like, can you please have like a disable double click? And that was only within like the last 2 years that came out.
Oh wow!
So for the longest time, the reason why I wasn't using FamiTracker is mainly because of that double click, and I just didn't realize it.
That's funny.
So this was what I had to do as a result, was all of this work just to keep working in ModPlug.
So have you been working in FamiTracker then recently?
I haven't had an excuse to, but if there were ever another NES soundtrack that I needed to work on, I would definitely do it in FamiTracker at this point.
That's cool. That would be awesome to actually hear your music coming out of a real NES. That would be so cool.
Yeah.
He needs inspiration. We need to immediately come out with a game. He could do PixelTunesRadio, the game.
The game.
The NES game.
The Adventures of Mike
the
and Ed.
Soundtrack. Yeah. It'd just be a lot of complaining and
All right. You start the Kickstarter and we'll get it going.
Yeah.
All right.
Be a lot of euphemisms, a lot of...
in-jokes.
Well, here's
in-jokes.
the funny thing with Nintendo music, too. The real conundrum there is that most Nintendo projects they don't pay a lot because it's usually a really quirky, like, smaller project. Retro City Rampage is basically the biggest NES sort of project that I think has ever been made in the modern day, like, because it is actually NES. He programmed it to be 8-bit. The thing is, usually it takes me an exponential amount of time longer to make NES music with an exponentially lower amount of money. So
it's just not financially sound.
Yeah, it's not financially sound to make Nintendo music the way I do, because it takes me too long to make it. So that's where we're at right now. Like, that's why I haven't made NES music in a while, because it takes a long time to make, and it's very emotionally taxing. Like, when a track gets rejected, an NES track, that's the most crushed I'll ever feel. Like, if another track gets rejected, or just they don't want it or they don't like it, I can work with that. Like, okay, change the instruments, blah blah blah. With Nintendo, it's like you just didn't like the notes. It's like that's so much harder to like wrap your head around. So yeah, it's a very frustrating thing to work with as a job, but it's the funnest thing to work with as a hobby. So with Nintendo music, it needs to be your thumbprint. Like, your musical instinct needs to be what shows there. So if there were ever a Nintendo project that I worked on where they're like, hey, we're just going to commission you to do your interpretation of this, and like no rejected tracks, that'd be the only way I could really do it from an emotional standpoint. Again, it's a very love-hate thing to do as a job, but hobby's definitely the fun thing to do.
All right, so we need to figure out a way to pay him for this soundtrack.
Well, that's where the Kickstarter thing came in.
Well, I was going to suggest
it would just be one of those goals where if like we meet $2 million, then it'll make it worth his while.
Right. Well, I was just going to suggest we could pay him in Taco Bell.
That's right. Food budget I'll get covered. Yep, that makes sense.
There you go. Perfect.
Excellent.
All right, let's move on to our next track. This one's Matt's pick. It is Twisted Metal, the 1995 release on the PlayStation 1. This track is Rooftop Battle, and it's by Chuck E. Myers, Tom Hopkins, and Lance Lenhart.
And we're back. That was Rooftop Battle from Twisted Metal. Came out on the PlayStation in 1995. Composed by Chuck E. Myers, Tom Hopkins, and Lance Lenhart. I feel like this is like the evolution of the Aliens Lair theme in terms of video game music. You know, you've got that very kind of cinematic, doesn't really follow a solid tempo. I get shades of action cinema mixed with like some Batman the Animated Series in the end where it's building up towards that climax. It's like dun 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 dun, very staccato, very cool stuff. And it's got like world instruments in there and guitar, and like they really went all out for this, especially for like 95, where CD audio was just kind of started becoming a mainstream thing. You know, you were still listening to like crappy MIDI synths that they, you know, slapped into a CD and just called it better than chiptune, you know?
Right.
So Matt, what was your reasoning for picking this particular track?
It's funny, with this game, it's a very nostalgic time to remember when 3D games started coming out and how they could almost do no wrong, because you come from this with Nintendo games and Super Nintendo games. I always thought they were kind of like cartoons, and you were playing a cartoon, and I pictured it like that because they were always cartoony looking. When 3D games, or even when Mortal Kombat came out, you started seeing things like, oh, this is like real life now, this isn't even a cartoon. And so when you start getting 3D and like real modeled cars and physics and sound effects, like this is sort of the time where games started getting real looking and real sounding. And it's like really rudimentary now, but at the time, it's like I was trying to remember how amazing it was at that time. And Twisted Metal was a game I remember reading about in GamePro and stuff, and the concept of the game where you can drive anywhere in a 3D world and try and like kill your other opponents and stuff, like that concept to me was mind-boggling. And I actually bought Twisted Metal before I owned a PlayStation, because I had a friend that had a PlayStation and I could bring it over to his house, which is funny, I should have just left it at his house, but I would always bring it over to his house so that we could play it. But yeah, Twisted Metal was like a very seminal game for me, and in terms of music as well. This was one of the earliest games I can remember actually sitting cross-legged on the floor and listening to the sound test screen and being like, that is amazing. Like this, like it's weird because I had an older brother, I had older siblings, and when you're the youngest sibling, like your siblings will show you music, sort of try and get you into it, and there's nothing they could do to get me to like the music they liked. Like I just like your parents too. Like I don't want to listen to the music you're liking. I can't.
Yeah,
it's just I have this natural rejection to it. So when I was sitting cross-legged, it was like the first time I had to accept to myself, like, I actually really like this. And there was a lot of tracks on this soundtrack in particular that I would have picked for this show. I didn't want to pick the one that I did listen to the most, because I was in 8th grade when this game came out, or 7th grade, 8th grade, right around that time. And I remember coming home from school and just loading it up on the TV and listening to the song and sitting on the floor cross-legged, literally listening to the soundtrack for this game. One of the songs from the first level, I can't remember the name of it. It's a really rockin' song that has a lot of metal influence. Like, there's a lot of guitar in it, insane solo, but it also has harmonica in it. So I'm like, well, I don't want to really like put a harmonica out here. But so I picked this track because this was another track where this is the rooftop level of the game, and this is the, like, at the time it was probably the biggest arena that I'd ever seen exist in a game, because you see these rooftops and you can zoom way out if you want, and you can just see how big the playing field is, and you just get the sense that things are going down. Like, this is a very last boss kind of song, and this is just, it's an epic track top to bottom.
Definitely. So I gotta ask, all those times where you had that CD sitting at your house, you didn't have a PlayStation, but you loved the music, did you ever realize that you could throw that CD in an actual CD player and listen to the music that way?
Here's the thing, I didn't even have a CD player at the time.
Oh,
like,
man.
That's how little I liked music at the time. My first exposure to music was me literally holding up a pair of headphones plugged into the microphone jack of a Ghetto Blaster, because you can still use it as a microphone for some insane reason.
Yeah.
Holding those up to the speaker of my TV and recording the Mega Man 3 soundtrack. Like, that was the first thing I'd ever listened to on my own.
That's
was this
funny.
Bootleg tape of Mega Man 3 music. So I was like out. I wasn't even listening to music at all, basically, until this game came out. And so when I finally got my own PlayStation, like, that's what I would do, is I would listen to it on the floor as if that was my way of listening to music.
That's really
playing
cool.
it from the PlayStation.
Huh. As far as your gaming history goes, like, what was your first console? Was it the PlayStation, or did you have like a Nintendo or a Genesis earlier on?
Yeah, it started with Atari, but I was a little too young to actually like or enjoy the Atari. But the Nintendo, basically from first grade to 7th grade, or sorry, first grade to like 3rd grade, I think, it was all Nintendo all the time, and then it went Sega Genesis, and then Super Nintendo way late in that cycle, then PlayStation, then from then on it was PlayStation 2 and everything PlayStation basically at that point.
Cool. So when you were a kid, did any of those video game soundtracks kind of stick out to you that you felt like kind of influenced you later on, or were you just kind of like cared more about the gameplay than the music at that point?
It was sort of half and half. I remember with Mega Man 2, my brother and I used to write our own lyrics to the songs and sing it, because there's this part in Bubble Man where it's like da, 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 and then I can't remember. There was this one part where we would write our own lyrics, and the lyrics that I had were "and go Blado." That's what I would say. Like, it doesn't make sense, but
yeah.
So like that little drum hit.
Yeah. So music was always something I paid attention to, but it wasn't really until like the 7th grade that I started realizing music was a very important part of video games. It started with sound test screens, like you if you own a game, you kind of experience every aspect of it, and you'll eventually find yourself in the sound test screen, like listening to the music or the sound effects, and at a certain point, doing some homework in grade. I'm jumping ahead of myself a bit here, but I would do the same thing with certain Sega Genesis games, like just listen to those sound test screens as if they were the music I'd be listening to normally. I distinctly remember my brother making fun of me for doing that.
We
We've all been there.
Yeah. So yeah, it wasn't until roughly this PlayStation time, though, that I was realizing that music was basically one of the main things I enjoyed about the games. Like, they added everything to the experience.
So, listening to this track, I honestly thought that it was a Tommy Tallarico track, because you've got those wailing guitars on top of those like really bombastic, rising, like ascending melodies, and really reminded me of something from like the Terminator Sega CD soundtrack. But I was pretty impressed by this one. The composers, there's 3 composers labeled to this. One of which is Tom Hopkins, which he's only credited for Slam Dunk Typing in '97 as a production
Slam
assistant.
Dunk Typing?
Yeah, Slam Dunk Typing.
Sounds boring.
I know, yeah. So, I don't know if this guy
Maybe he was sound production or something like that.
I'm thinking production, yeah. And then Chuck E. Myers, who has been working since '95 on Warhawk, and then he jumped on the Twisted Metal, Twisted Metal 2, Looney Tunes Racing, Rogue Trip, Frogger Beyond. I mean, he's done a bunch of stuff.
So Sony in-house stuff.
Yeah. His latest game was with Disney Infinity, the 3.0 edition starter pack, and of course Toy Box 2.0, and just Disney Infinity in general. Okay. So he was kind of the main composer and music score guy behind that. And then Lance Lenhart, the 3rd composer, Warhawk, Twisted Metal, Jet Moto, Twisted Metal 2. So he kind of worked with
989.
With him. Jet Moto 2, his final game was Triple Play 99, and that was music written by him for the 1998 release for that. So
cool.
Yeah.
I always wondered what else these guys did.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's especially like Disney Infinity, because those games contain like the entirety of the Disney properties, like in one game.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure he was probably managing music from all sorts of those IPs, and probably composing music that kind of fit in between those. So yeah, that was probably a really difficult and huge job. So good to know that he's still out there doing good stuff.
Yeah, definitely.
Excellent. All right, so what do we say we move on to our next one?
Yeah, so our next track is Slayin', and this is Ed's pick. The track is In-Game Theme. Let's go ahead and listen to it.
And we're back. That was In-Game Theme from Slayin', composed by our special guest today, Matt Creamer, a.k.a. Norrin Radd. It's another NES-style tune.
Yo, that track was slaying.
It was slaying.
Son.
I feel like, you know, when the guys from Dragon Force are finally like in their 90s and they can't play so fast anymore, they play everything halftime.
Right.
This will be that track. It's got that level of like, you know, complexity and progginess going on.
Halftime Dragon Force, yeah.
Exactly. Dragon Farce.
Dragon Force.
Fair enough.
8-bit Dragon Force.
Yeah.
It's definitely like, I love, especially towards the end with that that's totally like, as you put it earlier, like NWO BHM, like classic, not quite power metal, but still in that like Iron Maiden vein. So
Iku Mizutani style stuff,
yeah,
you know?
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, like simplistic melodies. That's when we talked to Iku Mizutani, that was a lot of what he said, is you want to make sure that you focus on making the melodies memorable, and
especially because they're going to loop over and over again as you're playing the game.
So would you say that that's the case, Matt, as far as like the trick to composing is making something like sound very memorable and simple but like complex at the same time?
Yeah, that's kind of the name of the game with Nintendo music. You can't really do anything but that. Like, there's not really a way to do a nice ambient Nintendo song without putting a ton of like Fallen style like arpeggios in there and stuff, which is really hard to do with ModPlug. So fortunately, it's almost impossible to not write something that's very melodic or melody based. So yeah, it comes down to, did I write the melody that the developer wanted for this game? So when we were actually writing music for this game, I always try and get descriptive words from the developer and be like, give me a bunch of examples of games that have that descriptive word to you. So one of the words they had was heroic, and this is where I learned, because this is a German developer, so I'm sure English is not their first language, but we did it all through Skype and correspondence and stuff. So when they said they wanted a heroic game, the first thing I thought of was like, oh, it should sound like the Contra boss theme. That's the most heroic song that I know of. That's heroic incarnate. So when I wrote a song like that for them, they immediately said like, no, this isn't exactly what we were looking for. So I had to be more savvy with how I'd be asking them, okay, send me some stuff that you find heroic, and that's how we kind of arrived at the sound. I can't remember what they sent for this one, but yeah, it just kind of ended up based on their feedback. This is what sort of fell out of me. Regarding
music, actually, and this brings me to kind of like questions that other people ask, but also I was going to ask as well. What type of music, based on this like non-video game music related, inspires you to create music?
Movie soundtracks, definitely something that I analyze a lot. I try and bring over as much as I can from that. But yeah, other than that, it's it's asking such a ridiculous. I listen to the stupidest music. Like I can't be satisfied with just listening to a good song. I have to have extra layers to why I appreciate the song. Like, well, this is a good song because it was written in 1984, which was the first year that someone could have commercially got like FM sounds, but it was also from a non-English speaking country, so they didn't have all this stuff. Like I have all these stupid layers to it. So I don't know. The thing with me is like discovering music. So if I discover something that I think is untouched, or not untouched, but if I discover something that I don't think has influenced anything that I'm already sort of aware of, then I want to incorporate it immediately. So I'm always trying to find like new influences. So it doesn't really matter what it sounds like. It's just like like adding tools to the toolkit, I guess. So I'll listen to absolutely everything for that.
Right. I kind of know how that is, because I mean, like, my musical palette kind of jumps all over the place. I mean, 1 minute I'll be listening to, no joke, I have Spice Girls on my phone, to something as extreme as, like, Cannibal Corpse.
Right.
So, like,
you got to keep an open mind about that.
Yeah, like, I'm all over the place as well, so I feel you on that.
This game is it's mobile only as well, and it's a very simple kind of one level, one horizontal plane, side scroller. Waves of enemies come at you, and you basically have to beat them all. It's basically how many enemies you slay.
Okay.
You have 3 buttons on the screen. You've got left and right and action, so you can move left, move right, and shoot. And so you get a couple different characters you can play as, and they have different attacks. It's basically the only thing that really differentiates one character from another. So you might have a character that kind of like the archer will like run his bow across the ground and then shoot an arrow up, like like an axe motion from like Castlevania or something, or you'll have somebody that just slices a sword, or somebody that might shoot a projectile straight. So the game itself is very, very simple, and there's only one in-game track, which is this track that we just listened to. So regardless of what your background looks like, regardless of what stage you're in, you're going to be hearing this track just kind of punctuated with like the boss music track. So it's I like the fact that this particular track is so varied and so dynamic in places, because you don't really get tired of listening. It doesn't feel like a loop that just goes over and over again. Once you've heard it the third time, you're still kind of picking new things out of it that makes it sound new and fresh. So, I played the game for probably about 20 minutes, and I was, listening to the song over and over again, and I never felt like I wanted a different song to play. So, nice job on that, Matt. You did good.
Oh, thank you. That was actually exactly what the developer was asking for, too. Since they only wanted one in-game song, they didn't want, like, here's the forest level, here's the cave level. They just wanted that one song, and they wanted it to be, like, heroic and adventurous, and they wanted it to be long. That was the big thing. Like, they needed it to be long. And it's funny, like, I could write you a Nintendo song that's 30 seconds long in one sitting, no problem. Start to finish, and it would be ready to rock. But every 5 seconds you want to add to it after that adds hours upon hours upon hours to the track. And the longer it gets, the longer it takes to add stuff. And so with this track, it took so long to write, because when you're dealing with these fundamental tones and the way that these melodies are, like, you start picturing your song in terms of patterns. Like, well, I've already done that pattern, so I can't do it again. So, like, what's another variation I can do? So by the end of this song, it's like I'm tapped. I've tapped out every variation I could come up with, and I never want the song to sound boring, which is something I do anyways. But it's one of the reasons why I don't usually write really long chiptunes. But in this case, they wanted a very long song, and they did an update. So that's where In-Game Theme 2 came out.
Okay.
And so that's another super long track. And it was funny when they contacted me for that one. They're like, yes, so do you want to make us another 2.5 minute long chiptune? Like, oh, jeez. But yeah, it worked out. I'm glad that it has that effect, because it would have got really boring if it was just the 30-second loop or a minute loop that just plays over and over and over again.
Yeah. Was that Slayin' 2 even Slayin'er?
The updated one? Actually, I do actually like that track better, because in the timeline of things, I actually wrote In-Game Theme 2 after Venture Kid came out. So I used the Venture Kid template on In-Game Theme 2.
Oh, cool.
Okay.
So I find that the Venture Kid template was just better at sounding smooth. Like, I find the Slayin', it's a little in your face. It's very...
It's very bass heavy.
Yeah, that's one of my problems. I think I have actually a hearing problem where I think I hear bass differently than I should. Like, I have tinnitus, so it's like I always hear ringing anyways. Like, I think I can't get bass right, because when I compare it to Vert's stuff or something, I always think, why does his bass sound so controlled and so nice, and mine just sounds booming all the time? So I'm sure there's just some problem I have with it.
The unfortunate thing is because a lot of these games are mobile games. If you're not listening to them in headphones, you're hearing them out of these tinny Android or iOS speakers.
That's true.
And you're not getting that bass anyway.
Yeah.
So, I think maybe sometimes pumping up the bass is a little bit better, because that helps it come through on those little monaural speakers a lot more anyways.
That's true.
So.
That's true.
Yeah, it's funny for Slayin', actually, to mix it, I actually use this thing called an impulse response, which is where you can simulate a reverb of an actual space. So you could simulate the reverb of a very specific church, or even a piece of gear. It's the way they have like a snap, a sound that's just basically a snapping that goes through a room, and then they somehow take the reverberance of that snap and they can modulate a sound based on that, so it sounds like it's in that room. It's called impulse response technology, or convolution reverb. And so what I would do is I would use an impulse response of an actual iPod, iPhone, so that I could listen to the song after what it would sound like on those speakers. And so I was trying to actually mix it correctly, but I'm sure I haggered it somewhere along the lines. But the in-game version, like, at least I was trying. Like, I want, like, Nintendo tones, they already sound very, like, bold and they're in your face. So I was trying to make it so I don't want it to, like, break these speakers or anything. All part of the struggle.
Yep. I've only listened to the game in headphones, so I'll have to go listen to it in regular speakers, like regular iPad speakers, and report back.
Well, let's jump into our next track. This is Matt's pick. This is War Song from the 1991 Genesis release, and the track is called Friendly Fight, also known as Player Phase 1. This track specifically was composed by Hiroshi Fujioka, but the rest of the tracks were composed by Noriyuki Iwadare and Isayo Mizuguchi.
Yep, this was also called Langrisser in Japan.
Right. welcome back. That was War Song, the 1991 Genesis track. The track was called Friendly Fight Player Phase 1, and it's by Hiroshi Fujioka. The rest of the soundtrack is by Noriyuki Iwadare and Isao Mizuguchi. This is a great track. I was commenting while we were listening. There's so many different elements from so many other composers that I kind of heard through this track. Like, specifically, there's like a hand clap motion. It's just like one hand clap, and then it kind of rolls into the next part.
Yeah, that sound is kind of soloed out.
And like now, whenever I hear that, all I can hear is like Motoi Sakuraba.
Yeah.
And then you also had...
like the El Viento and Ernest Evans soundtracks.
Yeah, Ernest Evans, yeah, exactly. And then you also kind of heard a little bit of like Matt Furniss, Sean Hollingworth in there with those like...
that little disco segment with the little arpeggios in the background.
Right,
felt very Matt Furniss.
Well, that, and then I was also going to say with the drums later on, when you hear like the with the drumming, it's almost like a xylophone in a way. It's pretty crazy, but
Neil Peart style.
Yeah,
all the way around the 180-degree circle.
Definitely. So yeah, I gotta ask. Like, I've never even heard of this game, so I'm curious. Like, where did you pull this from?
This was one I had in my childhood. One of my brother's older friends had this game, and he used to lend it to us. And this is when I was in 3rd grade. I'm only like 8 years old, and this is a strategy game, sort of like Shining Force, if you guys know that one. It's like Shining Force, only in this game, if your characters die, they stay dead for the rest of the game.
Very similar to Fire Emblem.
Yeah, exactly. So this was a game that I just played as a kid and didn't know how to play it, and just like brute forced my way through it. And the music definitely helped. Like, this is one of those games that the soundtrack is just really it's easy to keep playing the game because the music is so rockin'.
Yes.
When you guys hear the simulation of the guitar in the song, it's done with FM. Like, I love that.
Yeah.
They clearly wanted to have like sort of the digga digga digga, like a little guitar riff there, but it's with FM. And there's a little cowbell in the background with FM. Like, they just really wanted to go for this sort of band atmosphere with this. And like, there's key solos like
yeah.
So they really did like this whole sort of fusion rock sound with FM. It's pretty brilliant.
Yeah, and a lot of these composers also came from composing for games on like the PC-88, PC-98, SharpX 68000. They all were FM sound-based computer systems in Japan. So when they started working on the Mega Drive and Genesis, they'd already had lots of experience with both less capable and more capable FM chips than the YM2612 and the Genesis. So that kind of shows off why this song is so good, because they were used to working with limitations, but they were also used to working with chips that allowed them to use more instruments and more operators per instrument and sampled drums that were kind of like natively baked into the chip. And so they kind of brought all of that experience and technique into this game, which is why, for a game that was released, as early as 1991, you get this really solid sounding FM soundtrack that, you really didn't hear much until like probably 93, 94, when people started getting really more experience with composing for the Mega Drive. So kind of ahead of its time a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this was also Hiroshi Fujioka's first game for composing. So he did War Song, and then he followed it up with Star Odyssey in 91, Headbuster in 91. Kind of jumped around. He did Langrisser 3, which obviously War Song, Langrisser 3, since War Song is Langrisser. And then his last game was 2006, Atelier Iris 3, Grand Phantasm, which he was labeled as coordinator. So probably just like a
sound manager.
Yeah, sound production, whatnot. And then we've talked about Noriyuki Iwadare like tons of times, so we're not really going to get into
the Lunar series is his bread and butter.
And and then Isao Mizuguchi also worked on the Langrisser series. Kind of bounced all over the place, but has done a lot of stuff. Also worked on Sylphid as well, which we've talked about. Steel Empire, who's a music composer on that. Langrisser 2, Lord Monarch, Choaniki, like some of the Choaniki games.
Oh yeah, those are great.
All right.
And then his last game that he worked on was Lunar Silver Star Harmony, where he was labeled as a sound producer. So,
okay.
He's worked very tightly with Noriyuki Iwadare.
Yeah.
Right.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So, Matt, is this one of the soundtracks that influenced some of your FM compositions?
Oh, yeah, definitely. There's a track on Treasure Buster. I think it's the Hall of Death. It's the last level in the game. That track, I actually used this this track that we just played is one of the ones where I ripped every channel to its own WAV file and opened it up in Cubase to see exactly how they made the song sound the way it did. And so like how they get their guitar sound, I don't know. Is it one instrument, or are they using 2 channels? You know, things like that. So I found out exactly their method for creating this sound. So like with FM, to get a patch, like sort of if you're gonna get like a preset sound for an FM bass or something, you can make it sound really similar to the FM bass that the actual Genesis had, because there's ways like the ROM hacking communities found ways to like sort of extract the information from the actual operator registers, so you can it's just values, like, you know, attack value this, release value this, blah blah blah, for all the different operators, and you can just toss it into whatever FM VST you're using, so you can get a really accurate sounding, you know, simulation of what they were doing. So I was using the same sounds that they were using as well.
That's cool.
For that Holodeath track.
So speaking of Treasure Buster, why don't we just jump right into it? This is stage 1. This is Slam Dancer, which is such a great name for a track, but let's go ahead and slam dance a little.
Let's get it.
Yeah.
Alright, we're back. That was Stage 1, Slam Dancer, from the game Treasure Buster, released on iOS, composed by the man of the day, Norrin Radd, Matt Creamer. So FM style on this one. So we've now hit like all 3 of the major chiptune style consoles, I guess minus the Game Boy, which is also pretty popular. But so this one, I think I did get a chance to watch your YouTube video on your making of this soundtrack, Matt, which was awesome. It was so informative.
Oh, cool.
Nice close-ups on each track, and literally like how you made almost every individual sound. I really enjoyed it. The one thing that stuck out to me though that kind of differed this soundtrack from like your Super Nintendo or your NES style soundtracks is that you did end up using more tracks than just a standard 6 that the YM2612, right? So you went a little beyond what not that that's a bad thing at all. I mean, the composition is absolutely amazing. So aside from like War Song, what other games or FM music inspired you to make this soundtrack?
Oh, FM in general. All FM, like... It was something I didn't realize until sort of halfway through my Nintendo chiptune career, but I like FM better. FM is my favorite sound. When you think about the 80s, because I'm big about the 80s, like, and it's not just like, oh, 80s everything, 80s clothes, blah, blah, blah. The 80s were a time where analog and digital crossed over, and there was, like, and a lot of that is the FM. FM is where digital synthesizers became, like, commercially available. Yeah, there's just something about the FM sound that... Before FM, no one had heard FM before, and so this is like an example of an instrument that was created in modern time that it's unique to modern time. Like, it's not like a piano or a violin or like some variation on those. Like, it's one frequency modulating another one in a melodic capacity. Like, that's the future. That's future of music. And so I really just love the sound of FM. It's just got this cold. It can sound super cold or it can sound super warm, but it's always like got this punchy sort of iconic sound. And yeah, anything to do with FM, like you give me, I don't know if you guys had followed, but I do this Summer of FM hashtag where I basically just post a bunch of songs from the 80s that have FM in them. It's mostly just FM bass, but
yes.
You know, an example would be Danger Zone has FM bass. Aha's Take On Me, FM bass. Like, and so there's a lot of tracks that you don't recognize or you don't realize that they're just bathed in FM stuff from the 80s. And the more you break it down, like it really was the sound of the 80s, and it really was the sound of like sort of digital and analog sort of changing hands. But yeah, anything, all FM, I'm on board.
Like I was telling Matt before we started, this is probably my favorite soundtrack of his. I mean, I myself, I'm total FM too.
Yeah.
Like when I started getting into like sharing VGM on the web and like the baby days of PixelTunes Radio.
Right. The baby days.
I was
like Muppet Babies,
yeah,
but PixelTunes Radio.
When we were kind of like standing on the table to reach the microphone because we were so short. When your world looks kind of weak. I was very much a Super Nintendo guy. I thought Super Nintendo was the way to go because of the samples and you change, the way it sounds and blah, blah, blah. And the more FM I listened to, the more I got into it, and the more I realized I really, really like it. And I still enjoy the Super Nintendo stuff, and I still enjoy the sample-based stuff, but I feel like the best of FM is just so much better than the best of SNES. And so, yeah, I'm right with you there, Matt. I really appreciate a good FM song so much, and especially like you were talking about stuff that's like vocal pop that came out in the 80s but still uses that FM bass. It just adds so much more warmth and depth to that music.
I will say I have a stronger appreciation more than ever, now 93 episodes into PixelTunes Radio for FM synth than I ever did. I mean, I also didn't really own a Genesis until, I was in college.
You were mostly just picking straight up NES.
Yeah, I was an NES. I was a Nintendo fanboy through and through, so NES and Super NES was like my bread and butter. So now I wouldn't say that I prefer Genesis to Super NES. I don't think of it like that, in all honesty, in terms of music.
It's okay to be wrong.
It's okay to be wrong. But I would say that the NES is like king for me. Like nonstop, I could listen to NES music all day if it's good and it's got really like awesome layers like what Matt's putting into like Venture Kid and all that type of stuff. But when you play a track like this, Treasure Buster, it really just makes me want to dance. Like, it's just really awesome FM synth.
Yeah.
And it really does bring me back, just like Matt said, to those times of the 80s. And you really perfectly described this track in terms of pairing it with the 80s. I couldn't have said it any better myself.
So Matt, now that we've heard all of the different styles that you've pretty much composed in, as far as like emulating console music goes, which is your preferred style to compose in? Do you like the SNES or the NES or the Genesis style better?
Genesis, 100%.
Yeah, it sounds like it to me. I mean, you just sound very enthusiastic when you're talking about it.
Yeah, it makes me smile. And that's not to take away from the Nintendo or the Super Nintendo. Like, you load me up with like the piano sample with the proper SNES echo from Chrono Trigger, I will write you a song, no problem, and I will love every minute of it. But there's something about FM that I feel almost like FM is an underdog, or that it didn't get a fair shake. Like, when people think about the 80s, they usually, kind of laugh a bit, like, oh, the 80s were this goofy time, and like, but I don't see it like that. Like, I really think FM has this potential. It's like when you, like I said earlier in the show here, I always ask what year something was made so I can compare it to other things and know if it influenced them or if it could have influenced them. And I feel like FM died way before it should have, because when keyboards in the late 80s came out, they started doing sampling technology like the Super Nintendo had, and they could, we don't need to simulate the rock guitar anymore, now we'll just have a rock guitar sample. And so FM, it didn't get to live its lifespan out correctly. Like, it got pushed to the side too quickly, and I feel like, and in the early 90s, people who used FM sounds would be seen as kind of dorky. Like, there was a time from like 94 to 98 where it wasn't cool to like 80s stuff. Like, it was really embarrassing to like stuff from the 80s. And the FM is like at the kernel of that. Like, you can't like this stuff. You know, like you said, I believed for a long time too that the Super Nintendo was the better sound chip, just because like I felt like their stuff sounded more professional, and I was like, oh, well, if you were to just give random people a demonstration of what video game music was like, I probably wouldn't pick an FM track to show them over, like, say, like Final Fantasy track, say, like, here's your example of video game music. But now, like, I just know how to explain it more. Like, if you compare Shining Force 2, which I think is the finest FM soundtrack on the console, the Sega Genesis, and I was gonna pick one of their songs, but I decided to go with War Song instead. Okay, well, like, you know how I said the Super Nintendo was like an exponential version of the NES, where, like, they have 8 channels now that they're using to their fullest? Well, the Genesis was like that, but even more so, because they still didn't have the samples to benefit their, like, slap bass or guitar. Like, they still had to simulate those sounds. And so what the Genesis would do a lot was they had these PSG channels. They had 3 of them, so they could hit square waves as well. And in terms of NES sounds, it would be the 50% duty cycle square wave. So it's kind of just a sine wave, it kind of sounds like. And so what they would do with that is they would pair a lot of their leads with a square wave playing at the same time. And the square waves gave everything this really smooth sound to it. So it's not just FM. They add this sort of concept to the way of writing music, where they add the square wave to add smoothness. And so with the Treasure Buster soundtrack, like, a lot of the people that do Genesis chiptunes now, they don't actually use those PSG square waves, because I don't know if they don't know about it, or one of the reasons is they might be using software that doesn't have the square waves. Like, it might just have the FM. Like, I don't know if Defil Mask, which is kind of a tracker, I don't know if they have the square waves now. They might now, but they didn't for a long time. Using those square waves, you have to, you know, like, rip every channel and look at them separately to see, like, oh, the square wave was mixing with this to create this sound. And, you know, so to get the authentic Genesis sound, you have to use those square waves. So to tie it all back around, like, I like working with the Genesis the most because I feel like there's the most untapped potential there. Like, when you get to samples, it's kind of done. Everything's done. It rests on how good the samples sound, and then how good you can manipulate those samples to sound like fuller or more realistic. But with Genesis, like, I just feel like it wasn't explored enough. They could have gone further, I guess, is how I would put it.
For sure, and especially like the Sonic the Hedgehog soundtracks were probably one of the best uses of combining that PSG and FM, because those tones kind of meld together so well. And it's not until you, like, finally get in there with, like, VGM play or something and start, you know, stripping out all of the FM stuff that you realize that there's these you know, melodic helpers, all these square waves kind of helping the song become more full behind it. And you're like, oh, I didn't even realize that was there the whole time. So yeah, I totally understand what you're talking about there.
I think, that being said, Sega Genesis, I think, has the potential to sound the worst as well. There is some god-awful soundtracks on the Genesis.
Anything using the GEMS driver, which we've talked about in the past, a lot of it is pretty rough sounding.
Or anything sadly composed by, like, American composers. For some reason, Americans just did not know what to do with the FM hardware.
It's true. All right, well, let's jump in from the old to the new. This is a little bit newer. This is L.A. Noire, and this is 2011's release on the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. This is the main theme. Matt picked this one, and it's by Andrew Hale and Simon Hale. Everybody wake up. That was L.A. Noire. 2011. Ed, wake up.
Oh, that was a great dream.
PlayStation 3, Xbox 360. The track was the main theme by Andrew Hale and Simon Hale. Other than The Getaway, which they both worked on, they worked on L.A. Noire, and that was it. Turned into a ninja. Poof. American ninja.
Well, I mean, with the way this soundtrack is, they're probably working on more like commercial music and stuff.
Yeah.
Or production music, because this has that kind of sound to it.
Just Miles Davis. Just oozes Miles Davis.
Yeah. So Matt, this is another kind of surprising pick, at least for my perspective. Why did you pick this one for the show?
When we're talking about themes, like the melody, the actual theme of this track, this is another one, like, you get me on the right mood, and like I can crack out a tear to this track. This is one where, like, when that trumpet comes in, it's just something about that melody that like I can put my own story to it. Like, it's something personal to me, that trumpet melody. So I wanted to kind of share a diverse spectrum here. I didn't want it all to be like orchestral, bombastic, crazy tracks, but
Sure.
you know, in the grand scheme of things, I've listened to this track more than most. This is a track I actually listen to a lot, and when I would load up this game, like I said in the break there, I would just watch the title screen with the lights flickering, like the little halogen lights they had there, and just listen to this track at least until that trumpet part comes in. And I used to do the same thing with Mass Effect too. Like, the song at the start of Mass Effect was another one that I was maybe gonna pick, but that's another like low-key sort of, you know, mellow track. There's just something about this theme, yeah, it really gets me.
Yeah, I really like the combination of the vibraphone and the brush drum kit.
Yeah.
It just feels so smooth.
Yo,
It's
brush
just great.
drums is the way to go when you want smooth.
Oh, especially for this genre.
yeah.
Funny that you guys mentioned smooth, because Andrew Hale is actually one of the composers who's been working with Jade her whole career, so Smooth
Okay.
Operator.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, that makes sense.
So like
Yeah.
commercial composition.
You
bit,
nailed
kinda.
it.
Yeah.
So yeah,
for sure.
Jade's a phenomenal artist, and like all
Yeah,
of her
definitely.
albums in the 80s, like, they're some of my favorite stuff, and her vocals are some of my favorite vocals ever. So it was when I saw that he was writing the music for this game, like that is another one of those things where it added a little piece to it. Like, what a cool time we live in, where like this is the kind of music we have in games now, or potentially like you can get this kind of music in a game. It's a hell of a time.
Yeah.
No, Jade is really good, actually. Very underrated.
Yes.
And her voice is very, like, sultry and jazzy, yet still, like, has this almost, like, exotic feel to it, in a way.
Yeah, well, it's very baritone, like it's a very
Yeah.
low voice, and for such a small person too, she really belts out a deep, sort of strong voice, and
It's funny, I remembered playing the beginning of L.A. Noire and like just never finishing it, but I didn't remember why. And I'm looking at the date, 2011, that this came out, and I realized that was the year my youngest son was born.
There
So
you
I
go.
had a 4-year-old and an infant at the house. Like, no wonder I didn't have any time to play
Nope.
video games.
Nope,
Probably
nope.
because I was too busy, like, elbow deep in diapers and Matchbox cars to
Yes.
do anything other than...
Sometimes Matchbox cars in diapers.
Oh, that's not... Yeah, that probably happened at least one
yeah,
or two times.
probably.
Yeah.
Probably.
Ugh.
Gross.
Anyhow, so yes, so the game itself pretty much kind of follows this kind of theme. It's a very authentic kind of 1930s,
Kind of like an
style
interactive
game.
game.
Yeah,
in
like
a
a
lot
film
of
noir
ways.
style.
Or an interactive movie in a lot of ways.
It's by Rockstar, so it was kind of gritty. It wasn't exactly for kids, which is probably another reason I couldn't play it very much in the house. But yeah, I remember the voice acting being really good. I remember all the characters were like motion captured. So it felt like, like you were watching a movie, like, you know, Metal Gear Solid style.
Definitely.
Like, equal parts movie to game kind of a feel to it.
yeah.
This game actually had a feature that I wish more games would lean into, where if you fail a mission 3 times, it gives you a prompt saying like, hey, do you just want to skip the action sequence here? And that, I feel like game developers, this is one thing, like maybe if any of them are listening, like, you have to remember that there's people out there that haven't been playing games their whole life, that they don't intuitively understand what's going on. And like, whereas all of us, we can lose a mission and we know what they're trying to go for. We can tell immediately when we're put into an action sequence, like, oh, I think they want me to shoot that thing or do this. Like, but there's people out there that they don't have that, and you're not excluding them from your games by not having like what is essentially like a I am a beginner feature. And I feel like games, like even like a BioShock game, if you just had a I am a beginner feature, like legit beginner, and it's one shot, it just kills a guy. Like, because people can't even aim in some of these games.
It's true.
Like, there's great storylines too. Like, these games have cool stories and the music and everything, and for people not to be able to experience it just because they don't know how to use this 8-button like dual wielding controller, like so that's why I really appreciated that this game had that, because I watched my wife go through this game in particular, and having that option there. She didn't always take it, but you know, every time you lose a mission or something, like the frustration grows, and especially if you're doing like a what do they call it, like a tailgating mission, or where you have to like tail someone, and if they spot you, oh, mission failed. Like, those are just so monotonous that people that are getting into games right now, they don't really understand, like, oh, don't worry, like, it's not your fault, that's just a BS mission, like, that they're gonna happen.
And then people are gonna be more likely just to put the game down and never finish it, you know, rather than work at it and work at it and work at it. So
I can imagine being a kid now and trying to play a Contra game.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In the world that we grow, that they're growing up in.
It's funny you say that, because when I got Venture Kid, I have the family share on my iPad. My kids both have iPads, so it automatically downloaded to both of their iPads. So I walk into the kitchen one day and they're both playing Venture Kid and, like, you know, trying to, like, get to the second level, because that was the big thing. They couldn't even get past the first level. But it was fun, like, hearing the music coming from, you know, both of the iPads kind of, like, in sync with each other, and they're both playing together. But it was like, you know, they were bad at it because they've never played Mega Man before, and they don't have any sort of concept of side-scrolling. Everything is 3D, you know. You're manipulating objects in a 3D environment. So when you put these, like, paper flat objects, it's like it's
impossible.
It was difficult for them to get their mind around.
Wow,
like,
that's the reverse for us. That's the opposite way.
Yep. Yeah.
Totally backwards
it's totally
from how
strange,
we are.
Yeah, because we grew up on 2D and kind of evolved to 3D.
Games evolved with us, which is great, because now we're proficient in both.
Right.
But for kids that are that you know, young kids now, like my 11-year-old, forget it. Don't put him in front of a 2D game ever. He's first-person shooter all the way. Yeah, it's like our version of, like, you know, Charlie Chaplin films. You know, it's like they look at them like black and white, you know, silent movies or something.
We'll just be all walking around with, like, 1930s and 40s accents, like, "Hey there, Sonny, do you want to play some Super Mario Brothers?
I hear the new Mega Man just came out today."
Oh, well, boy, put on that Mega Man. Let's jump into our very last track. This is Matchland. This is Ed's final pick, and this is in-game music.
And we're back. That was in-game music from Matchland, composed by Matthew Kramer. I chose this track because when I was listening to it, I was kind of reminded of the Joe and Mac soundtrack on the SNES, especially like kind of like that B section, the later part, where a lot of those kind of like almost caveman style
xylophone.
Like the percussive elements kind of came in, and that was one of my favorite soundtracks growing up. So it was kind of like nice to find a little parallel. It's a very smooth style soundtrack. Now, was this composed to be in the SNES style, Matt, or was it just kind of, because it almost kind of feels like SNES, but then it feels a little more cleaner than SNES would be too?
Yeah, this one, it's just a concept I have called HD memory, where you remember the way the SNES sounds, but maybe not us because we're too close, but the average person remembers the SNES as sounding a lot better than it actually did sound. So when you plunk them down and say, like, here, listen to what it actually sounded like, they probably cringe a lot. So the key for like a composer is to know why the music sounded good back in the day, but make it sound like people think it sounded like. So you need to know what the limitations were, but know how to break them without like breaking the whole thing. And so with this, like I'm sort of mixing in Super Nintendo sounds, and the developer initially wanted, like, this is actually the same developer as Swap Heroes.
Okay.
So initially the developer said, yeah, we like the Super Nintendo sounds, but we don't want it to be authentic. Like, we don't need it to be authentic. So the sky's the limit in terms of that. So it's composed sort of like a Super Nintendo song, but I'm using synth, and I actually bought specifically for this like a marimba sample library, so I could get that sort of xylophone sound and have it be a little more velvety than if it were just like a Super Nintendo sound. And that's kind of the name of the game for a lot of the projects I'm working on these days, is to do sort of mix the Super Nintendo sounds with the actual versions of them. So like string sounds too. I didn't do it in this one, but to mix Super Nintendo string sounds with actual string orchestra sample libraries, and then like sort of compress them together so they sort of fuse and mesh. Did
you find that composing in this kind of, quote unquote HD memory style to be easier than following the limitations of the Super Nintendo, or were they about the same? It really depends on what the developer asks for, because there's another game I'm working on called Dice Mage 2 that should be out soon, and I made it roughly as soon as this project ended. I started Dice Mage 2, so I was using kind of a lot of the same concepts, and they wanted a lot of the same concepts as well. In fact, both developers asked for SNES Plus, so that was basically their description. Like, it doesn't have to be SNES, but like that's kind of where we're starting here, and then everything else you want to add is okay. And that developer for Dice Mage kind of asked for different stuff, and that made it easier. So it's a matter of what they want me to do, because they're basically commissioning me to make something, and so their criteria is what I go by. And maybe other composers that are a little more diva-like, they can be like, no, you're getting what I give you, and that's fine. But like I kind of agonize over their description, so I keep asking them, like, you got to send me more descriptive words and just examples of other tracks that kind of hit the sound for you. And maybe I should stop doing that, because it always just makes it worse on my part, unless the developer has like easier stuff. Like, there's certain types of music that I write more naturally, and this Matchland, for example, is not something I would write naturally. Like, if you sat me down in a room and said, hey, write some music, it would never come out sounding like this. This is a direct sort of response to the criteria that the developer had, because it's almost like a puzzle game for me. Like, okay, you've given me all your criteria, and now I have to try and make a song in my style with your criteria. So it's a lot like Nintendo limitations, where like, oh, I want to write a death metal track through these limitations. So I want to write one of your tracks through my own limitations, or the other way, I want to write my own track through your limitations.
It's funny that you mentioned the diva thing, because now all I can think of, and I'm sure that he's not all this, I'm sure he's a very nice guy or whatever, but I could just picture like Jake Kaufman be like to the game developers being like, no, I am Jake Kaufman, and you will dance to this. Like, don't even. Like, this is your track. It's gonna rock. It's gonna be dancey. You will like it.
Well, it's funny, because when we were talking to Matt Furness when we had him on our show, and he was talking about how, like, in the very early days when he started out, when he was working on Amiga and a lot of the earlier Atari ST and stuff like that, he would just write a song, hand it in, and the developers would be like, cool, we'll just, like, maybe didn't even listen to it. We'll just stick it right in the game.
Right.
But then as he got, higher and higher up the levels, and he started working for Disney, he would have to do like 12, 13, 14 rewrites, until everything sounded correct. And I feel like that's kind of like where the mobile and the indie scene is getting to now, where like originally when these games started off, composers had it really easy, where they could just write a song, throw it in, boom, we don't care.
Oh, it's action music,
background music,
whatever.
Yeah. But now it's like it's getting to that point where people are getting much more concerned about the marketing and the branding of their game, because the market is so competitive right now.
Yeah.
Is that kind of how you feel about the whole thing too, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what made this track kind of hard to compose. Like, it seems like a really simple track, and it shouldn't have been hard to compose, but this type of game, like a match 3 puzzle game that has sort of microtransactions in it, they don't want a track that's going to challenge the gamer. So I'm this bombastic songwriter. You look at all the stuff I made before I made music for games. It was all like, I made an 8-bit death metal album, for gosh sakes. Like, that's like, I come from like wanting to push things to their absolute extreme. Like, you give me limitations and I'm gonna see exactly how far they can go, and then the next time I'll go even further. And so with this game, they're like, look, we don't want the gamer to want to stop playing. You know, like, we want them to like have this thing in the background that makes them feel good about playing the game. We don't ever want them to feel bad about playing the game. Like, the idea is like, if you lose the game, you don't want them to be like, oh, I lost. You want them to be like, oh, I'll try again, or I'll play again.
Right.
And so, like, the whole background, my background was like, if you were to break it down, would be like, this gamer's gonna hate themselves when they lose the game. Like, I'm gonna write the saddest, most like savage song, like, you lost and I can't believe it.
You should feel bad.
Right. Yeah.
Like, you should feel so terrible about yourself. And you know, it doesn't work for games that are like this. So it's been a fun challenge, I guess, to try and be a composer for games nowadays, especially mobile games, because they need a different type of music, and it's not music that I necessarily want to write on my own. And I one thing I hope people don't think like, oh, this is the kind of music that, you know, Matt Creamer writes. It's like, this is the kind of music I write based on these criteria. Like, it's more like that. Whereas a game like Treasure Buster, that was a game that also was a mobile game. Me and the developer for that game, we were talking just on Skype, and I said, man, my ideal project would, because I just come off a really hard project, like a year and a half working on it. Game never came out. I wrote an hour of music that got rejected, and an hour that's accepted, but the game's still not coming out. So like, that was a really tough project for me to work on.
Sure.
And so me and that developer, we were talking. I'm like, man, my ideal project would just be a game where every song is the last level, and like every song is a boss theme, and not just a boss theme, but the final boss theme. I want a game where like every song is like insane. Yeah. And he's like, oh, okay, let's do that for Treasure Buster. So
nice.
Treasure Buster was like, there was no limits. It was just like go, go, go.
Yeah.
Right.
And in fact, he was the only developer I've ever worked for where he's like, can you make it faster? Like, could it be more intense? I'm like, yes, again. Like, I just came from the ringer where it's like, actually, one of the things for the game that didn't get released, they said they wanted a track that was strange and dangerous. Those were the 2 criteria that they gave me. So I'm like, all right, like, if you want a strange and dangerous track, like, I know how to do that, and I will give you a very strange and very dangerous track. And their criteria, or their response, or their criticism after it was, I guess it's just a little too strange and dangerous. Like, and I loved that so much, I almost put it on my business card.
Too strange and dangerous.
Too strange and dangerous.
That is hilarious.
Like, I included on the soundtrack the original pitch that I sent for Matchland, and like, just the difference between that and what actually ended up in the game. Like, it's very funny that this is what I think it should sound like this fast track that's like kind of energetic down to like super mellow and like just kind of playful. Like, it's just funny that it works out that way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. All right, so what we want to do, just to wrap it up, is we want to ask you some like rapid fire, like last minute questions, just to kind of wrap everything up and get everyone's questions that did ask questions on our Facebook group or sent in emails to PixelTunesRadio. So from Ben, also known as the Dyad, he asked, what programs do you use to compose VGM? He said, I'm assuming FamiTracker for Retro City Rampage, but the Matchland soundtrack, for example, isn't chiptune at all. Cubase
is where all the music gets written now. If I can do it, like, if I needed to do Nintendo music now, if there was a way I could do it in Cubase and have it like hit that sort of HD memory, I would do it, just because it's easier from a composition point. Like, that's one of the reasons why I would use ModPlug, is because composition is the most important thing to me, and I found that because of that double click thing I said, the FamiTracker was really hard for me to use, and it was hindering my composition abilities. It's mostly Cubase now if I can help it, but yeah, all the Nintendo stuff was ModPlug, just because for some reason I couldn't gel with like the nuts and bolts of how FamiTracker worked, even though it is the one I should have been using realistically. Right. Okay. Ben also asks, who are your VGM influences? Kenichi Matsubara made the music for Castlevania 2. And he's not credited, which is crazy. So he's not credited in the game anyways, but so I don't know how that was ever found out, but that's the name that floats around on the internet now. But he's also responsible for apparently Crisis Force as well, which is a game I never played as a kid.
Yeah, it's Famicom only.
Yeah, Famicom only, but that's one of the best Nintendo soundtracks I find out there right now. So this guy, he's just like, that's kind of the neat thing about these Nintendo composers. They're like idols to a lot of us, but they just don't exist. They're gone. Like, I don't even know where this guy is now, where he was, and he wrote this music 30 years ago. And that's one for sure. Castlevania 2 was a game that like I had as a kid, and when you get into Dracula's Castle, I remember that's kind of the example of where I was never happy with poppy sounding Nintendo music. I was always happy with like the ones that made me feel gross in my stomach, like
same
like that
here,
Dracula's Castle song. It's just an arpeggio, but there's no enemies in the castle either. Like
it's
I
haunting.
Felt terrifying.
It's a
haunting.
very, very haunting moment in that game because it's like there's no enemies and it's just
you feel like something's gonna pop out at you.
Yeah.
There's this moment of dread that all the way up to the boss.
Yeah, dread is a great way to put it too. And so that was a good one, and I always find it weird that he's not credited in the game. But I also really like, and I've never even pronounced this before, Shigemasa Matsuo from Roller Games and Base Wars.
Okay, old Konami guy? Yeah.
But yeah, Roller Games is a game, that was one of the first games I ever bought used from like a store we have. I actually live right next to the store now, but it's a store called Willow Video, and it was the first video game store that I ever saw selling used games. And Roller Games was one of the first ones I ever bought, and the soundtrack for it just happens to be like one of my all-time favorite on the NES.
Yeah, it's good. It's definitely good.
That's a great one. And yeah, same guy made Base Wars, which I actually owned as a kid, straight up. So, you know, I ended up growing up with a lot of this guy's music, or girl, I don't even know if that's a male or female name. But he did the music for Batman Returns as well, I think, which was also pretty rockin' sounding.
Yeah.
But then, yeah, we go right down to Iku Mizutani. Like, that's one of the staples. Like, when I first found out about NSFs, that was the guy. Like, okay. Like, because I knew about H. Maezawa because I'd beaten the game tons of times, Contra. I've beaten the game tons of times, but it was fun to learn about these new composers, like around the late 90s with NSFs and stuff. Like, you'd find these composers, and I needed to know more. I want to know more games that this person worked on. I still do that.
You're able to like connect the dots. All these games that you played when you were a kid, you didn't realize the same person was behind all of them. It's really cool.
Definitely.
But then Ninja Gaiden, Keiji Yamagishi, big fan. All the Tecmo stuff, like Tecmo Super Bowl especially. Like, what a great soundtrack that is. Even though the songs are like 30 seconds long, the tiniest little loops, but and little like backstory, I'm sure they're short loops because the producers were saying the game, or the developers might have said to the composer, like the gameplay only lasts for like 30 seconds. It doesn't need to be a longer track. So so write it short. That's what I get a lot with games now. They're like, well, this little screen where you open up a treasure chest is only like 10 seconds long, so it doesn't need to be a long track, even though by default I want to write long tracks that have this long evolving melody. But
all right, so we're going to jump over to Daniel Lawton's question. He asked, given the diversity of music composed between Venture Kid to Retro City Rampage to 8-bit death metal, what inspires you to compose music the way you do?
Yeah, it really depends on the medium, and it depends on the concept. Like I said, sometimes I'm like, oh, I want a galloping riff in this song, and then the song just creates itself from there. But other times, with 8-bit death metal, that was a concept as well. Like, I want to hear what 8-bit death metal would sound like, and with that, you start to think like, okay, well, the Nintendo had that DPCM channel that could play little rough samples and sometimes vocal samples as well, like Blades of Steel.
Yeah.
So that alone got me thinking like, well, okay, if you were to do death metal on the Nintendo, you could do vocals on that DPCM channel if you wanted, if it could handle like a long enough track. So it's like, all right, I'm breaking the limitations. The Nintendo could never hold something that big, but this is what it would sound like if you could. So the concept usually is where I start, especially with chiptunes. So because I've also learned that Melodia di Infinita, the first chiptune album I put out, is a good example of like, if I don't have a theme, it just kind of ends up sounding like that. Like, that's kind of me in my natural raw state. But when I do have a theme, like, I guess Matchline's a good example too. Like, instead of using 8-bit death metal, they were saying, could you make it sound like a Match 3 microtransaction kind of game? So it always involves me learning as much as I can about whatever that theme is. And with 8-bit death metal, it's funny, I used to have to do like an hour-long commute to and from BCIT, just a technical institute in BC that I would go to. And the whole last year of going to BCIT, I was just like, I want to write music. I don't want to be here. And so I would drive into school, and I'd have this notepad on the passenger seat in my car with a pen and a notepad, and I would like no-look write down the time indexes of tracks I was listening to at the time, and I'm like, learn how they did this. Like, this is I need to learn, like, not only like the death metal drum beats and stuff. Like I needed to learn exactly, like when you think about a blast beat, like is it kick first then snare, or is it snare first then kick? Like
right.
different bands do it different ways. So I would always have all these indexes. I have a whole booklet full of indexes of things that I'm like, learn this, learn that. And it was not just death metal, but it was also 70s prog, where they had a lot of time signatures that I was not aware of. And so I would take their drum signatures or their drum patterns and transcribe them into NES stuff. A lot like Castlevania 2 has that Dwelling of Doom song that is exactly note for note Yngwie Malmsteen song. Far Beyond the Sun, I think. I can't remember, but it's like note for note. And so you guarantee yourself that, okay, they were listening to that album when they wrote that Nintendo song. Like they couldn't have not. I'm doing kind of the same thing when I come up with these limitations. Like I play the role of the producer, the developer, and the composer, and I just come up with like, I always just picture this funny scene of like the producer walks in and just throws a bunch of tapes down on a table and says, make the game sound like these, and it's like, here's some Iron Maiden and here's some of this, and then the developer's like, oh geez, I don't know, we only have the sound chip, how do we make this stuff? Like, it's not my problem, just make it sound like it.
So Alex Messenger asks, is Norrin Radd composing music for Shakedown Hawaii?
Heck yeah, he is.
Awesome. Sweet.
Very cool.
Looking forward to
cool.
that.
That'll be awesome.
Yeah, no vert this time though. It's just I'm soloing this one.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. So everyone will be glad to know about that. I actually didn't even know that myself, so that's awesome.
Yeah, that's going to be great.
And then I think Ed has a question, then I have a question.
Oh, yeah. One last question from me. So during your studies, we were just talking about this kind of stuff, during your studies of how each console worked before you started composing in that style, which of those consoles surprised you the most in terms of complexity or capability?
I guess, I knew the other two, like I knew Nintendo and I knew Genesis were very complex going in, but I had no idea how complicated the Super Nintendo was. And like I said, coming from, there was a point in time, maybe like 8 years ago, I would have actively said like, I don't like Super Nintendo music because I think it's too easy to make. Like, I was that egotistical and that like stuck up about it. Even though I had a lot of Super Nintendo music I liked, I just didn't care to listen to it over, say, Genesis or NES. But once I had to do that Swap Heroes game, that was where I ate all of my words. Like, there's posts you can find of me on like old forums where I'm like poo-pooing Super Nintendo music, like that. But man, I ate my words hard. Like, they put so much more effort into Super Nintendo music than I ever gave them credit for, and it's just as complicated as Genesis and everything else. The thing is, like, Super Nintendo music can sound crappy too. Like, if you get like Wayne's World for Super Nintendo, it's not gonna sound great. It's gonna sound bad. But the best Super Nintendo music, especially that early first sort of generation Super Nintendo music, they were exactly as inspired by the limitations as the Nintendo were. Like, they were innovating in ways that like you would not expect them to innovate. Like even like Lavos and his voice, like they did stuff that you don't think about and no one would know like until you like crack open these ROMs and see. So yeah, Super Nintendo, I'll never poo-poo it again. Super Nintendo is legit, and it, you know, I love the sound. I loved it. I always loved it. I just thought it was too easy to make, but having made it now, it's not easy to make at all, and it's
you gave me a new appreciation for it too, so.
Definitely.
Yeah, definitely.
My final question is, which video game IP would you love to work on?
Mass Effect.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, that was, when Mass Effect came out was right around the time that Drive, the movie, came out.
Oh yeah.
And I wasn't using Cubase at the time. I was still using ModPlug only to make my music, and that's a long story too. I didn't feel like learning how to use MIDI and Cubase, so I just put it off for like 10 years. And so when Mass Effect came out and when Drive came out, and just the synth that they had, it was very reminiscent of the 80s, and not the FM 80s, but like the synth 80s, which was another big part of the 80s.
Right.
And so that was it. I was like, all right, I gotta learn this stuff. I gotta get into this now. That was it. The Drive soundtrack, which, you know, wasn't even super synthy. It just had the aesthetic of the movie. And then Mass Effect, which was very synthy. Like the title screen for Mass Effect was another one I almost picked. So yeah, Mass Effect, it reminds me of a perfect mix between Star Trek and Star Wars and like maybe Blade Runner, because a lot of the music as well. And it was the perfect IP, and gosh dang it, they buried it. They threw it under the bus. It's the saddest thing. But yeah, the Mass Effect 1, 2, and 3, some of the best moments in video gaming that I've ever had were from that series, and I would have loved to work on it at the time. Nowadays, maybe not so much. I think the IP is maybe a little toxic now. Like, look, I got to a point where I read the 3 novels that came out. Like, I was deep into Mass Effect.
You were into it, yeah.
And like, I was like on message forums saying like, no, I think this is what's going on with the ending and blah, blah, blah. Like, I was deep. But like
That's
I
cool.
said, it got me into making music that all the music that I hear now or that I'm making now. But it's just something to do with synth and maybe cyberpunk and sci-fi. Like I'm way into that stuff, even though I've never really had an excuse to write it. Like I wrote basically a cyberpunk song that's kind of like Blade Runner meets Neverending Story or something like that.
Okay.
Like it's a movie sort of soundtrack. And that's kind of where if I didn't have to write music for games, like where they're giving me the criteria, that would be the criteria that I give myself. So Mass Effect was a pretty close approximation of like what I would like to be doing if I had no other obligation.
Awesome.
Okay. Very cool. All right. Well, we want to thank everyone who sent in questions. Emily from VGM Jukebox, Ben the Dyad, Chris Murray, Daniel Lawton, Alex Messenger, Brian Mosley, and Cam Childs. Thank you very much for sending in questions. And we also want to, of course, thank our guest, Norrin Radd, which, by the way, Norrin Radd, obviously a reference to Silver Surfer, am I right?
Yeah.
That's what I figured, yes. So we want to thank you, Matt Creamer, for stopping by PixelTunes Radio and chatting with us. Definitely, thank you very much.
Yeah, we had a blast, dude. We learned so much. Like I said before, it's so nice to have composers on the show because you give us a whole new perspective on like the behind-the-scenes stuff that, because, Mike and I aren't composers. We really love video game music, so it's always nice to get some insider information from guys like you. So again, thank you so much for chilling out with us for a couple hours today.
Oh my gosh, it's been my pleasure, guys. And like I said, you guys have given me perspective on stuff too. So, don't go poo-pooing yourselves. Like you guys you're a key part of this. Like you guys are on the other end of the music, and it's really great to hear from you guys and how you interpret the music and what you enjoy about the music as well. It's been really fun having this chat with you guys.
Yeah,
Awesome.
It's just nice to give spotlight to the guys that do video game music. So speaking of which, where can we find your stuff on the web? I know you have YouTube and Bandcamp and all that stuff going on.
Well, I got my website's usually where everything sort of funnels through, so mattcreameraudio.com. So most of the links, like if worst case scenario, you just go there and there's links to like my social media and my Bandcamp and my YouTube. But yeah, I have YouTube and I have some blogs and stuff. But yeah, just go to the website if you really need to. But if you type in Norrin Radd 22, usually things will come up. That's the crappy thing, since it's the Silver Surfer. I didn't realize at the time you can't go back on your internet name once you've got it. So there's a lot of Norrin Radds out there. So it's a little frustrating, but Matt Creamer Audio probably the best way to go.
We'll make sure to post it in the show notes, of course, so everybody can find you.
I appreciate it.
And as far as, Bandcamp and the soundtracks go, they're all pay what you want. So, definitely if you like the stuff that you've heard today, throw the man a couple dollars,
Yes.
Go download some cool stuff. I personally recommend Treasure Buster. That's my absolute favorite.
I bought the Venture Kid
is
soundtrack.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Retro City Rampage is a little bit different because that's, it's a concerted effort with a couple different composers. So you have a couple of, non-VGM albums that you've put out too, right?
Like Anomaly, for example, that's one that it wasn't for a video game.
Yeah, any of the death
right.
metal and that kind of stuff.
Okay.
So there's still some stuff that we haven't played on the show that you can go hear.
Yes. Very cool.
Yeah, the name your price thing was very important for me. I always when you think about some of the composers from cartoons in the 80s, like DuckTales, for example, like you can't really find that music anywhere. I think it was Ron Jones that made the music for it, but he's got a few little samples on his website, but there's no archive of it, and that's one thing I always wanted to avoid. Like there should always be access to this stuff in the future if people want to uncover it,
Definitely. That's going to do it for episode 93. Guys, thanks so much for listening. I know this was a long one. We really appreciate you, and also Matt Creamer. Again, check him out at mattcreameraudio.com.
As always, you can check us out on facebook.com/groups/PixelTunesRadio. You can check us out on Twitter at PixelTunesRadio, and you can check out our YouTube stream at youtube.com/dongled.
Episode 94 will be Light Gun Games, so stay tuned for that. And again, this is Mike and Ed signing off for PixelTunes Radio.
Peace out, everyone. We will see you next time.